Get your hands off me! The handcuffs slammed shut around Margaret Coleman's wrists. She was 72 years old. She had come to pick up her husband's heart medication. And now a police officer was shoving her face first against the pharmacy counter while customers watched in horror. "You people always have some excuse," Officer Derek Lawson sneered, twisting her arm tighter. Margaret's reading glasses cracked against the tile floor. Pills scattered everywhere. Her shoulder screamed in pain. But Margaret Coleman had a secret that would destroy this officer's entire career with just 5 words. What she said next changed everything. If you want to see how this satisfying story ends, subscribe to my channel and follow along until the very last moment. Drop a comment below telling me which city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let me take you back to where it all began. Margaret Coleman woke up at 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes before her alarm. She lay still for a moment, listening to Theodore breathe beside her. His breathing had changed since the stroke 4 months ago, slower, more labored. Some nights she woke up just to make sure his chest was still rising and falling. 49 years of marriage, and now every morning felt like a gift. She didn't know it yet, but this Tuesday would change everything. Margaret slipped out of bed and made her way to the kitchen. Coffee first, then toast cut into triangles the way Theodore's mother used to make it when he was a boy. He'd mentioned it once, maybe 30 years ago. Margaret had been doing it ever since. That was marriage, remembering the small things. "Theo, sweetheart." Theodore stirred when she brought him breakfast. The left side of his face still drooped from the stroke, but his eyes, those warm brown eyes she'd fallen in love with, hadn't changed at all. "Morning, Maggie." "I made your coffee and toast." "Triangles. Always." He pushed himself up against the pillows, wincing. Margaret pretended not to notice. He hated when she fussed. "What's on the agenda today?" "I need to run to the pharmacy. Your heart medication is almost out." Theodore's expression darkened. "I can go myself." "Theo, I said I can go. I'm not helpless." Margaret sat on the edge of the bed and took his hand. "I know you're not, but your physical therapy is at 3, and Dr. Patterson said no driving yet." "Dr. Patterson says a lot of things. Dr. Patterson kept you alive." Theodore looked away. Margaret understood. Her husband had always been a proud man. The stroke had taken so much from him, his independence, his confidence, his sense of purpose. "Let me do this," she said softly. "Let me take care of you." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "The prescription number is in my wallet. RX 447892. Metoprolol, 25 milligrams. "I know, Theo. Take one daily with food. Make sure they give you the brand name, not the generic." "I know." He looked at her, then really looked at her, and his expression softened. "What would I do without you, Maggie?" She leaned forward and kissed his forehead. "You'll never have to find out." If only she had known what was waiting for her at that pharmacy. If only she had stayed home. But she didn't. 3 miles away, Officer Derek Lawson sat in his patrol car staring at his phone. The text from Sergeant Morrison glared back at him. "Numbers are down. Need 3 arrests before shift end. No excuses." Lawson's jaw tightened. 3 arrests. He had 2, a teenager with marijuana and a homeless man sleeping in the park. 1 more to go. 14 years on the force. 14 years of doing the dirty work nobody else wanted to do. And what did he have to show for it? A rental apartment, an ex-wife who took everything, and a sergeant who only cared about statistics. He'd been passed over for promotion 3 times. 3 times. Officers with half his experience were making detective while he was still chasing quotas in a patrol car. "Numbers, Lawson. I need numbers." That's all he was to them, a number generator. His radio crackled. "All units be advised. Riverside District pharmacies flagged as high-activity zones for prescription fraud. Increased patrols requested." Lawson sat up straighter. Riverside. Rich neighborhood. Easy targets who wouldn't fight back. He started his engine. 1 more arrest. That's all he needed. And he knew exactly where to find it. Margaret arrived at Riverside Pharmacy at 2:15 p.m. The bell above the door chimed as she entered. The pharmacy was busier than usual. A line of 5 or 6 people snaked back from the counter. "Mrs. Coleman, James Patterson," the pharmacy manager waved from behind the counter. He was a pleasant man in his early 50s, with graying temples and a genuine smile. "Hello, James." "Oh, busy day." "Flu season starting early. How's Mr. Coleman doing?" "Getting stronger every day. Physical therapy seems to be helping." "Glad to hear it. I'll have his prescription ready in a few minutes." Margaret took her place in line. A businessman ahead of her kept sighing dramatically. A young mother struggled with a fussy toddler. An elderly man shuffled past muttering about his sciatica. Normal people. Normal Tuesday afternoon. She had no idea that a patrol car had just pulled into the parking lot. No idea that Officer Lawson was watching her through the window. No idea that she had just become his third arrest. Lawson studied the pharmacy through his windshield. The old black woman had caught his attention immediately. Elderly. Alone. Taking her time at the counter. In his experience, that meant one of 2 things: confused senior citizen or prescription scammer. Either way, easy target. He checked his phone again. 2:20 p.m. Shift ended at 6. Plenty of time to make this arrest and file the paperwork. His finger hovered over the text to Sergeant Morrison. Almost typed, "Got one," but stopped himself. "Don't count your chickens, Lawson. Make the arrest first." He grabbed his body camera, made sure it was recording, and stepped out of his car. Time to meet his quota. Margaret had just reached the counter when she heard the bell chime behind her. Something made her turn around. A shift in the air, a change in the room's energy. The officer was young, mid-30s, she guessed, with close-cropped hair and a jaw that looked carved from stone. He walked with a swagger that came from years of being the biggest authority in every room. His eyes swept the pharmacy. When they landed on Margaret, they stopped. She turned back to the counter, ignored the prickle at the back of her neck. She was 72 years old, standing in a pharmacy in broad daylight. What could possibly happen, Mrs. Coleman? "Your prescription is ready." James placed the orange bottle on the counter. Margaret reached for her purse. "Excuse me, ma'am." The voice came from directly behind her. Close. Too close. Margaret turned. The officer stood less than 2 feet away, his hand resting on his belt, near his weapon. "Yes, officer. I need to ask you some questions about that medication." Margaret blinked. "I'm sorry. The prescription." He nodded toward the bottle. "Is that yours?" "It's my husband's. He has a heart condition." "Your husband's?" The officer's eyes narrowed. "And where is he?" "At home. He had a stroke 4 months ago. He can't drive." "Convenient." The word hung in the air like an accusation. Margaret felt the first spark of irritation. "I beg your pardon. I said it's convenient. You picking up his medication." What happened next would change Margaret's life forever. But she didn't know that yet. All she knew was that something was very, very wrong. James Patterson stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "Officer, is there a problem? Mrs. Coleman is a regular customer. She picks up her husband's medication every month." The officer didn't look at James. His eyes stayed fixed on Margaret. "Sir, step back. This is police business." "Police business." James's voice rose. "She's just picking up a prescription." "I said step back." The words were quiet, but the threat was unmistakable. James retreated behind the counter. Margaret's heart beat faster, but she forced herself to stay calm. 26 years had taught her how to handle confrontation. Show no fear. Maintain control. "Officer, I'm not sure what the problem is. I have my husband's insurance card, his ID, and a medical power of attorney on file with this pharmacy. Everything is completely legal." That's exactly what someone running a prescription scam would say. "A prescription scam?" Margaret almost laughed. "This is blood pressure medication. Metoprolol. You can't even get high on it." "Don't tell me what I can and can't investigate." Around them, customers had begun to notice. Whispers spread. A woman with a shopping basket backed away. The impatient businessman suddenly found somewhere else to be. But one person wasn't backing away. A teenage girl near the greeting cards had pulled out her phone. She was recording everything. Lawson felt a flash of annoyance at the manager's interference. These people always had excuses, always had explanations. In his experience, the ones who talked the most were usually the guiltiest. And this old woman, she was too calm, too composed. Normal people got nervous when a cop questioned them. This one looked at him like she was evaluating him, like she was the one in charge. That pissed him off. "Officer, I would like to speak to your supervisor." "My supervisor isn't here." "Then I would like your badge number and your name." Lawson smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "My name is Officer Derek Lawson, badge number 4471, and you know what I think we're past introductions." He reached for his handcuffs. "Turn around, hands behind your back." The pharmacy went silent. "You're arresting me." Margaret's voice remained steady, but her eyes widened. "For what?" "Suspicious activity. Possible prescription fraud, resisting investigation." "I haven't resisted anything. You're resisting right now. Turn around." Margaret didn't move. Lawson felt a surge of satisfaction. This was the part he liked, the moment when they realized he had all the power and they had none. "Ma'am, I won't ask again." "Officer Lawson," her voice dropped low, "I am asking you one final time to reconsider your actions." "Is that a threat?" "It's a statement of fact. You are making a serious mistake." Lawson laughed. "The only mistake here is yours, Grandma." He grabbed her shoulder and spun her around. Margaret's hips slammed against the counter. Pain shot through her side as Lawson forced her arms behind her back. Her prescription bottle flew off the counter, pills scattering across the floor like tiny white beads. "Stop! You're hurting me." "Should have thought about that before causing trouble." The handcuffs clicked shut. The metal was cold, the edges sharp. Margaret could feel them cutting into her skin. "Please, these are too tight." "Good. Maybe you'll learn some respect." Around them, phones emerged from purses and pockets. The teenage girl near the greeting cards wasn't alone anymore. A dozen people were recording, maybe more. James Patterson stood frozen behind the counter, his face pale. "Officer, please. This is wrong. Mrs. Coleman is a good woman. Interfere again and you're joining her." James fell silent. An elderly man in a veteran's cap pushed forward. "This ain't right. You can't treat people like this." "Sir, step back. I fought in Vietnam for this country. I know right from wrong." Lawson ignored him. His attention was on Margaret, on the crowd, on the growing chaos around him. This wasn't going the way he'd planned, but it was too late to back down now. "Walk." Lawson pushed Margaret toward the exit. She stumbled, her arthritic knees protesting every step. "My husband is waiting for me," she said quietly. "He's sick. He needs his medication." "Should have thought about that before breaking the law." "I didn't break any law. We'll let the judge decide that." Something flickered in Margaret's eyes, something Lawson didn't understand. But he would, very soon. The automatic doors slid open. The parking lot was chaos, shoppers stopping to stare, drivers pulling over, phones everywhere. "What's going on? Is that an old lady in handcuffs? Somebody call the news." Lawson's patrol car was parked in a handicapped space. He opened the back door and shoved Margaret inside. "Comfortable?" She didn't answer. He slammed the door and stood in the parking lot for a moment, surveying the crowd. This wasn't ideal. Too many witnesses, too many cameras. But he'd handled worse. His phone buzzed. "Sergeant Morrison. Status." Lawson typed back, "Got one. Filing paperwork soon." He climbed into the driver's seat, already composing the arrest report in his head. Suspicious behavior. Prescription fraud. Resisting arrest. Clean and simple. He had no idea his career was about to end. Inside the car, Margaret sat perfectly still. The handcuffs bit into her wrists. Her shoulder throbbed where Lawson had grabbed her. Her reading glasses hung crooked from their chain, one lens cracked. 49 years of marriage, 26 years on the federal bench, a lifetime of service and sacrifice. And it had come to this. An elderly black woman in handcuffs being hauled off like a criminal for picking up her husband's heart medication. Margaret closed her eyes. She thought about Theodore waiting at home, worrying when she didn't return, his blood pressure rising with every passing minute. She thought about all the officers she had sentenced over the years, the corrupt ones, the brutal ones, the ones who thought their badges made them untouchable. She had shown mercy when possible, severity when necessary, but she had never tolerated cruelty. Margaret opened her eyes, and she made a decision. Enough. Lawson reached for the radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 47, one in custody from Riverside Pharmacy, possible prescription fraud, en route to booking." The radio crackled acknowledgement. He was reaching for the gear shift when he heard her voice. "Officer Lawson!" Something in her tone made him pause. It wasn't fear, it wasn't pleading. It was authority. "Save it for the station," he said without turning around. "I don't think you understand the situation you're in." Lawson laughed. "Lady, you're the one in handcuffs." "That's true, but I've spent 26 years putting people in handcuffs, and I've learned what happens when officers exceed their authority." Now he turned around. Margaret sat perfectly straight despite the restraints. Her cracked glasses hung crooked, but her eyes were steady and clear and utterly without fear. "What are you talking about?" "Your career, Officer Lawson, the one you've spent 14 years building, the pension you're counting on, the promotion you've been chasing." Lawson's jaw tightened. "You don't know anything about me." "I know you have 15 complaints in your personnel file. I know your training officers flagged you for excessive aggression. I know you've been passed over for promotion 3 times. The color drained from his face. "How the hell do you know that?" "Because I've read hundreds of files just like yours. Officers who thought they were untouchable. Officers who thought their badges were licenses for cruelty." Margaret leaned forward, her voice dropping low. "I've sentenced 23 of them, and I'm about to make you number 24. Lawson stared at her through the metal grating. His mouth went dry. "Who are you?" Margaret smiled. It wasn't a warm expression. "Run my name through your system. Margaret Ann Coleman, Federal Judicial Database." Lawson didn't move. "Run it." His hand trembled as he reached for the computer. His fingers shook as he typed the name. Margaret Ann Coleman, Federal Judge, Alabama. The results populated the screen, and Derek Lawson's world collapsed. Judge Margaret A. Coleman, appointed 1994, confirmed unanimously by the U.S. Senate, presided over 5 847 cases, specialized in federal criminal law, civil rights violations, and law enforcement misconduct. Lawson stared at the photograph. Younger wearing judicial robes, but unmistakably, the same woman sitting handcuffed in his back seat. The same woman he had called Grandma. The same woman he had shoved against a pharmacy counter. The same woman whose career had been destroying officers like him for 26 years. "This can't be right," he whispered. "But it is." Through the windshield, Lawson could see the crowd pressing closer. Dozens of phones pointed at his car, witnesses everywhere. His hand shook on the steering wheel. "I didn't know," he stammered. "You didn't identify yourself. I shouldn't have needed to." Margaret's voice was ice. Every person deserves basic dignity during a police encounter, regardless of profession, regardless of position. You didn't give me dignity, Officer Lawson. You gave me contempt and cruelty and handcuffs that are cutting off my circulation. I was just doing my job. Your job is to protect and serve, not to harass elderly women, not to manufacture arrests, not to treat citizens like criminals because of their skin color. Lawson opened his mouth. Nothing came out. "There are 60 people outside this car recording everything. By tonight, this video will be on every news channel in America. By tomorrow, your name will be trending on social media. By next week, you will be the face of everything wrong with policing in this country." She paused. "And there is nothing, absolutely nothing you can do to stop it." Outside, the crowd had grown to nearly 100. James Patterson pushed his way to the front, shouting, "That's Mrs. Coleman. She's a regular customer. She was just picking up her husband's medication." A news van had arrived, cameras everywhere, and then someone shouted the words that changed everything. "She's a federal judge. They arrested a federal judge." The energy shifted instantly. Outrage became fury. "A federal judge. This is insane. Someone call the mayor." Inside the patrol car, Lawson sat frozen. His career, his pension, his entire life Gone. All because he wanted to meet his quota. All because he saw an elderly black woman and thought she was powerless. Margaret watched him through the metal grating, watched his hands tremble, watched his face crumble. Officer Lawson. He looked at her with eyes full of fear. Before you remove these handcuffs, and you will remove them, I want you to understand something. She leaned forward until her face was inches from the grating. What you did today wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. You chose to target me because I was elderly and black and alone. You chose to humiliate me because you thought I was powerless. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. You were wrong. Lawson's breath came in shallow gasps. What are you going to do? Margaret sat back. Her expression was unreadable. I'm going to do what I've done for 26 years. I'm going to pursue justice. I'm going to expose the truth. I'm going to make sure what you did to me never happens to anyone else. She held his gaze. And I'm going to start by making sure you never wear that badge again. The crowd outside roared. Lawson reached for the door handle with a shaking hand, but Margaret wasn't finished. One more thing, Officer Lawson. He paused. My husband is at home right now waiting for his heart medication, the medication you just scattered across a pharmacy floor. If anything happens to him because of your actions today, her voice hardened into something cold and terrible. I won't just end your career. I will destroy everything you've ever built, everything you've ever loved, everything you've ever dreamed of becoming. She smiled. And that's not a threat, officer. That's a promise from a federal judge. Lawson stumbled out of the car. The cameras captured everything. His pale face, his shaking hands, his desperate scramble to undo the damage he had caused. But it was too late. Far too late. Inside the patrol car, Margaret sat alone for a moment. Her wrists throbbed. Her shoulder ached. Her cracked glasses hung uselessly from their chain. But she wasn't thinking about the pain. She was thinking about Theodore, about the medication he needed, about the promise she had made to him that morning. What would I do without you, Maggie? You'll never have to find out. Margaret closed her eyes and made another promise, a silent one. This officer would face justice. This department would face scrutiny. This system would face change. She had spent 26 years fighting for justice from the bench. Now she would fight from the other side, and God help anyone who stood in her way. Theodore was watching the news when Margaret finally got home. Her face filled the screen footage from cell phones playing on loop. Federal judge arrested at Montgomery Pharmacy. Maggie. Theodore struggled to rise, his face twisted with effort and emotion. Don't get up. Margaret crossed the room and knelt beside him. I'm okay. I'm here. I saw what he did. Theodore's voice cracked. I saw those handcuffs. It's over now. It's not over. His voice hardened. That son of a bitch put his hands on you. He treated you like I was nothing. Margaret finished quietly. I know. You're not nothing. You're everything. You're a federal judge. You're my wife. His voice broke. Margaret held him while he cried, this man who had been her rock for 49 years. She held him and whispered that everything would be okay. But even as she spoke, she felt the weight of what lay ahead. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every elderly person who had been targeted, every black citizen who had been profiled, every vulnerable soul preyed upon by officers who thought their badges made them gods. Margaret had spent 26 years fighting for justice. Now she was going to finish the job. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Drop this, Judge. You don't know who you're messing with. Margaret stared at the message. Then she showed it to Theodore. They're scared, he said quietly. They should be. What are you going to do? Margaret looked at her husband, this man she had loved for 49 years, who had supported her through every trial and triumph. I'm going to burn them to the ground. Theodore squeezed her hand. His grip was weak, but his eyes were fierce. Give them hell, Maggie. She kissed his forehead. I intend to. Outside, the first news vans were already pulling onto their street. The battle had just begun, and Officer Derek Lawson had no idea what he had unleashed. The first news van arrived at 7:42 p.m. Margaret watched through the living room window as a reporter climbed out, followed by a cameraman already hoisting equipment onto his shoulder. Within minutes, 2 more vans pulled up behind the first. "They found us fast," Theodore said from his chair. "They always do." The doorbell rang, then again, then a third time. Margaret didn't move. "You're going to have to talk to them eventually," Theodore said. "Not tonight. Tonight I make phone calls." She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. 26 years on the federal bench had given her a network that stretched from Montgomery to Washington. Lawyers, judges, journalists, politicians, people who owed her favors, people who believed in justice. Her first call went to Patricia Morrison. Patricia had served alongside Margaret for 18 years before retiring to teach at Howard Law School. They had tried cases together, shared chambers, gossip celebrated victories, and mourned defeats. If anyone would understand what Margaret was facing, it was Patricia. "I saw the news," Patricia said, before Margaret could speak. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine. Angry, but fine." "That footage is everywhere, Maggie. CNN picked it up an hour ago. It's going national." "Good." "Good." Patricia paused. "You want this to go national. I want the whole world to see what that officer did. I want them to see how he treated a 72-year-old woman picking up heart medication. And then I want them to watch while I take apart his entire department." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "You're not just going after Lawson." "Lawson is a symptom. The disease runs deeper. Quotas, Patricia. They're running arrest quotas. That officer targeted me because he needed 1 more arrest before his shift ended." "How do you know that?" "Because I've seen it 100 times from the bench. Officers who arrest first and ask questions never. Officers who pick their targets based on who won't fight back." Margaret's voice hardened. He looked at me and saw an easy statistic. An elderly black woman who would be too scared or too confused to challenge him. He picked the wrong woman. Yes, he did. The doorbell rang again. Margaret ignored it. "I need your help, Patricia. I need the Federal Judges Association behind me. I need amicus briefs, media support, and legal resources. This isn't going to be a simple civil rights lawsuit. This is going to be a war." "You'll have it. I'll make calls tonight. By tomorrow morning, you'll have half the federal judiciary in your corner." "Thank you." "Maggie." Patricia's voice softened. "How's Theodore handling this?" Margaret looked at her husband, who had fallen asleep in his chair. The stress of the day had exhausted him. His face looked gray in the lamplight. "He's scared. For me, for us. His blood pressure was through the roof when I got home." "Take care of him." "I will. But I'm not backing down, Patricia. Not this time. Not ever again." She hung up and immediately dialed another number. James Patterson answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Coleman, are you all right? I've been trying to reach you." "I'm fine, James. I need a favor." "Anything." "I need you to pull your security footage from today. Every camera angle you have. Don't give it to the police. Don't give it to anyone. A lawyer will contact you tomorrow to collect it properly." "Already done. I made copies as soon as you left." "That officer..." James's voice shook with anger. "What he did was wrong, Mrs. Coleman. Dead wrong. I've worked in that pharmacy for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like that. You tried to help me. I won't forget that. I should have done more. I should have... You did what you could. Now I need you to do something else. Name it." "Think back over the past year. Has Officer Lawson been in your pharmacy before? Have you seen him watching customers, asking questions, making people uncomfortable?" James was silent for a moment. "Now that you mention it, yeah, he's been in a few times. Always browsing, never buying anything. I thought he was just doing routine patrols, but he did seem to pay attention to certain customers." "Which customers?" "Older folks mostly. Minorities, people picking up prescriptions for family members." James's voice dropped. "Oh my God, he was hunting." "Yes, he was." "Mrs. Coleman, what can I do? How can I help?" "Keep those security tapes safe, and if you remember anything else, any other incidents, any other customers who seemed uncomfortable, write it down. Every detail matters." "I will. I promise." Margaret hung up and stared at her phone. The threatening text still glowed on her screen. "Drop this, Judge. You don't know who you're messing with." She didn't recognize the number, but she had a pretty good idea who was behind it. Her phone buzzed again, a new message from the same unknown number. "Your husband looks fragile. Stress isn't good for heart patients." Margaret's blood ran cold. They were watching the house. She moved to the window and peered through the curtains. The news vans were still there, reporters milling around with coffee cups and notepads. But beyond them, parked on the corner, sat a dark sedan with tinted windows. No markings, no plates visible from this angle. Margaret's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone and dialed 911. "This is Judge Margaret Coleman. I'm receiving threats related to the incident at Riverside Pharmacy this afternoon. There's a suspicious vehicle parked outside my home." The dispatcher's voice was professionally calm. "We'll send a unit right away, ma'am. Make sure it's not anyone from Officer Lawson's precinct." "Ma'am, you heard me. Send someone from a different district, someone I can trust." There was a pause. "I understand, ma'am. Stay inside and lock your doors." Margaret hung up and turned to find Theodore awake, watching her with worried eyes. "What's wrong?" "Nothing. Just being cautious." "Maggie." His voice was firm, despite its weakness. "Don't lie to me." "Not after 49 years. She crossed the room and sat beside him. "Someone's trying to scare us. Threatening texts. A car parked outside." Theodore's face hardened. "Police?" "Probably. Or someone connected to them." "Bastards." He struggled to sit up straighter. "They think they can intimidate us. They can try. Call the FBI." Margaret blinked. "What?" "Civil rights violation by a police officer. Federal judge as the victim. Potential witness tampering and intimidation." Theodore's eyes were sharp, despite his exhaustion. "This is federal jurisdiction. Call the FBI and get them involved before the local cops have a chance to circle the wagons." Margaret stared at her husband. Sometimes she forgot that Theodore had spent 30 years as a criminal defense attorney before his retirement. His mind was still razor-sharp, even if his body had betrayed him. "You're right," she said. "First thing tomorrow." "Tonight, Maggie. Call them tonight. The longer you wait, the more time they have to destroy evidence, coordinate stories, and make this whole thing disappear." He was right. She knew he was right. Margaret pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number for the FBI field office in Birmingham. The agent who answered sounded young and tired. "Federal Bureau of Investigation. How may I direct your call?" "This is Judge Margaret Coleman, retired from the United States District Court, Middle District of Alabama. I need to speak with the special agent in charge regarding a civil rights violation that occurred this afternoon." The agent's tone changed immediately. "Judge Coleman." "Yes, ma'am. Please hold." 3 minutes later, a different voice came on the line. Older, more authoritative. "Judge Coleman, this is Special Agent Michael Torres. I saw the news coverage. How can I help you?" "I want to file a formal complaint against Officer Derek Lawson of the Montgomery Police Department. I also want to report potential witness intimidation and threats against my family." "We're already aware of the situation, Your Honor. Our office has been monitoring the media coverage. To be honest, we were planning to reach out to you tomorrow." "Then I've saved you a phone call. I want a full investigation, Agent Torres. Not just of Officer Lawson, but of the entire department's practices. I have reason to believe this wasn't an isolated incident." "What makes you say that?" Margaret told him about James Patterson's observations, about Lawson's pattern of visiting the pharmacy, about the quota system she suspected was driving officers to target vulnerable populations. Torres listened without interruption. When she finished, he said, "That's consistent with complaints we've received from other sources. We've had the Montgomery PD on our radar for a while, but we've lacked concrete evidence to justify a full investigation. You have it now?" "Yes, ma'am, we do." Torres paused. "Judge Coleman, I have to ask, are you prepared for what comes next? If we open this investigation, it's going to get ugly. The police union will fight back. The department will close ranks. You and your family will be under intense scrutiny." Margaret looked at Theodore, who was listening to every word. "Agent Torres, I spent 26 years on the federal bench. I've faced down drug cartels, corrupt politicians, and organized crime. I'm not afraid of a small-town police department with delusions of immunity. Understood. I'll have agents at your home first thing in the morning to take a formal statement. In the meantime, document everything. Every threat, every suspicious vehicle, every unusual contact. And Judge Coleman, yes, be careful. You've made some powerful enemies today. Margaret smiled grimly. I've been making powerful enemies my whole career. One more won't make a difference. She hung up and turned to Theodore. FBI is involved. They'll be here tomorrow. Theodore nodded slowly. Good. That's good. He reached for her hand. I'm proud of you, Maggie. I haven't done anything yet. Yes, you have. You stood up. You didn't let them break you. His eyes glistened. That's everything. Margaret squeezed his hand. Get some rest. Tomorrow is going to be a long day. What about you? I have more calls to make. Theodore studied her face for a moment, then nodded. He knew better than to argue when she had that look in her eyes. Don't stay up too late. I won't. It was a lie, and they both knew it. Margaret waited until Theodore was settled in bed before returning to her phone. The threatening texts had stopped, but the dark sedan was still parked on the corner. Let them watch. Let them see that she wasn't afraid. Her next call went to Rachel Torres, no relation to the FBI agent, a reporter at the Montgomery Herald who had covered her cases for years. Judge Coleman, Rachel's voice was eager. I've been trying to reach you. I have about 1,000 questions. I'll give you an exclusive interview tomorrow afternoon after I've spoken with the FBI. The FBI is involved. They will be by morning. And Rachel, I want you to dig. Officer Lawson, his partner, his supervisor, the whole chain of command. Find out how many other people he's done this to. Find the pattern. You think there's a pattern? I know there is, and I want you to prove it. Rachel was quiet for a moment. This is bigger than one bad cop, isn't it? Much bigger, and when you expose it, make sure the whole country is watching. Margaret hung up and sat in the dark living room alone with her thoughts. Through the window, she could see the news vans packing up for the night, but the dark sedan remained a shadow among shadows. They thought they could scare her. They thought she was just another victim who would take a settlement and go away. They were about to learn how wrong they were. 3 miles across town, Officer Derek Lawson sat in his apartment staring at his phone. His sergeant had called twice. He hadn't answered. His union rep had texted 4 times. He hadn't responded. His mother had left a voicemail asking if he was okay. He couldn't bring himself to listen. The apartment was dark, except for the glow of his television, which was tuned to the local news. His face kept appearing on screen, grainy cell phone footage of him shoving an elderly woman into his patrol car. The chyron at the bottom read, "Officer arrested federal judge at local pharmacy." "This is the worst thing I've ever seen," a commentator was saying. A 72-year-old woman handcuffed and humiliated for picking up her husband's heart medication. If this doesn't prove we have a policing problem in this country, I don't know what does. Lawson grabbed the remote and changed the channel. CNN was showing the same footage. He changed again. MSNBC. Same footage. Fox News. Same footage, different commentary. It was everywhere. His face, his name, his badge number everywhere. His phone buzzed. Another text from his union rep. "Call me ASAP. We need to get ahead of this." Get ahead of it? It was already a wildfire. How do you get ahead of a wildfire? Lawson's hands shook as he typed a response. "What do I do?" The reply came instantly. "Don't talk to anyone. Don't answer questions. Delete your social media. Lawyer up." Delete his social media. Like that would help. The videos were already downloaded, shared, replicated 1,000,000 times across the internet. He could delete every account he'd ever had, and it wouldn't change a thing. His phone rang. Sergeant Morrison. This time Lawson answered. "What the hell were you thinking?" Morrison's voice was barely controlled rage. "A federal judge. You arrested. A federal judge. I didn't know Bo. You didn't check? You didn't run her name before you slapped cuffs on her. She didn't identify herself. She shouldn't have had to. She was an elderly woman picking up a prescription. What possible reason did you have to arrest her?" Lawson's throat tightened. She was acting suspicious, taking too long at the counter, reading the bottle too carefully. You thought what? That she was running a prescription mill out of a riverside pharmacy in broad daylight at her age? The quotas. Don't you dare blame this on quotas. Morrison's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. You're on your own with this one, Lawson. The department is going to distance itself as far as possible from your actions. You were acting independently outside the scope of your authority. That's the official position. That's not true. You told me to increase my numbers. You said pharmacies were priority targets. I never said that. You sent me a text. What text? I don't recall any text. Morrison's voice was cold. And if you try to claim otherwise, it'll be your word against mine. And right now, your word isn't worth much. The line went dead. Lawson stared at his phone, his heart pounding. They were cutting him loose. 14 years of service, and they were throwing him to the wolves. His phone buzzed again, a news alert this time. Breaking: FBI opens investigation into Montgomery Police Department following judge's arrest. FBI. The FBI was involved now. Lawson's hands trembled so badly he could barely hold his phone. This wasn't just a suspension. This wasn't just a lawsuit. This was federal charges, prison time, the end of everything. He thought about running, getting in his car and driving until he ran out of road, starting over somewhere nobody knew his name. But where would he go? His face was on every news channel in the country. He couldn't buy gas without being recognized. His phone rang again. Unknown number. Against his better judgment, he answered. Officer Lawson? The voice was female professional. This is Rachel Torres with the Montgomery Herald. I'm working on a story about the incident at Riverside Pharmacy, and I'd like to give you an opportunity to share your side. Lawson hung up. His side. What was his side? That he'd targeted an elderly black woman because she looked like an easy arrest, that he'd called her grandma and twisted her arm behind her back while she begged him to stop. There was no side that made him look good. There was only the truth, ugly and undeniable. His phone rang again. Same number. He let it go to voicemail. On the television, they were interviewing community members outside the pharmacy. An elderly black man in a veteran's cap was speaking into a microphone. I was there. I saw the whole thing. That woman didn't do anything wrong. She was just picking up medicine for her husband. And that officer, he treated her like a criminal, like she was nothing. Lawson changed the channel again. A legal analyst was explaining the potential charges he faced. Civil rights violations, false arrest, excessive force, potentially conspiracy if there's evidence of systemic misconduct. We're talking about federal prison time, significant federal prison time. He turned off the TV and sat in the darkness. 14 years of doing the job nobody else wanted to do. 14 years of dealing with the worst humanity had to offer. And now he was the villain. His phone buzzed one more time. A text from a number he didn't recognize. You should have left her alone. Now you're going to pay for all of it. Lawson hurled his phone across the room. It shattered against the wall pieces, scattering across the floor. He put his head in his hands and tried to figure out how his life had fallen apart in less than 12 hours. The next morning, Margaret woke to find Theodore already up dressed and sitting at the kitchen table with a legal pad full of notes. You should be resting, she said. I've been resting for 4 months. I'm tired of resting. He pushed the legal pad toward her. I made a list of everyone you should contact. Former colleagues, civil rights organizations, legal advocacy groups. If we're going to fight this, we need an army. Margaret looked at the list. It was 3 pages long, written in Theodore's careful handwriting. When did you do this? Couldn't sleep. My brain wouldn't stop working. He smiled, and for a moment, he looked like the man she'd married 49 years ago, sharp, determined, ready for battle. I may not be able to walk into a courtroom anymore, but I can still strategize. Margaret sat down across from him and took his hand. We're doing this together. Damn right we are. The doorbell rang at 8:15 a.m. 2 FBI agents in dark suits stood on the porch, credentials already in hand. Judge Coleman, I'm Special Agent Williams, and this is Special Agent Chen. We're here to take your statement." Margaret led them into the living room where Theodore was waiting with fresh coffee and his legal pad. "My husband is a retired attorney," Margaret explained. "He'll be sitting in on this interview." Agent Williams nodded. "Understood. Judge Coleman, we'd like to start with the events leading up to the incident yesterday afternoon." Margaret told them everything. The pharmacy visit, the confrontation with Lawson, the arrest, the handcuffs, the patrol car. She told them about Lawson's words, "Grandma, some you people. Learn your place." She told them about the threats, the suspicious vehicle, the text messages. When she finished, Agent Williams exchanged a look with his partner. "Judge Coleman, what you've described is consistent with a pattern of behavior we've been investigating for several months. Officer Lawson has been the subject of 15 previous complaints, all dismissed by Internal Affairs." "I'm not surprised. What might surprise you is that he's not alone. We've identified at least 6 other officers in the same precinct who exhibit similar patterns, targeting elderly residents, manufacturing arrests to meet quotas, using excessive force against vulnerable populations." Margaret leaned forward. "How long have you known about this?" "Approximately 8 months. But until yesterday, we lacked a credible victim willing to come forward and fight. Most people just want to put these experiences behind them. They take a settlement, sign an NDA, and move on." "I'm not most people." "No, ma'am, you're not." Agent Williams closed his notebook. "Judge Coleman, if you're willing to cooperate fully with our investigation, we have the potential to dismantle a systemic pattern of corruption that has victimized hundreds of people. But I have to warn you, it's going to be a long fight. The police union will push back hard. The department will try to discredit you. There will be attacks on your character, your career, your family." Theodore spoke up for the first time. "She's faced worse." "I'm sure she has. But I need to know, are you committed to seeing this through, no matter how difficult it gets?" Margaret thought about the woman she'd been yesterday morning, making toast for her husband, worrying about his medication, living a quiet retirement. That woman was gone now. In her place was someone older and angrier and more determined than she'd been in years. "Agent Williams, I spent 26 years fighting for justice. I thought I was done. I thought I could retire and let someone else carry the burden." She met his eyes steadily. "I was wrong. I have one more fight left in me, and I intend to win it." Agent Williams nodded slowly. "Then let's get to work." The next 3 days were a blur of interviews, phone calls, and media appearances. Rachel Torres published her first story on Wednesday morning. The headline read, "Federal Judge's Arrest Exposes Pattern of Abuse in Montgomery PD." The article detailed Lawson's history of complaints, the quota system that drove officers to target vulnerable populations, and the department's systematic failure to address misconduct. By Wednesday afternoon, the story had been picked up by national outlets. The New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, MSNBC, everyone wanted a piece of it. Margaret gave interviews from her living room with Theodore sitting just off camera, feeding her information and moral support. She was calm, articulate, and devastating. Every word was calculated to expose the rot at the heart of the Montgomery Police Department. "This isn't about one officer," she told Anderson Cooper. "This is about a system that enables and protects officers like Derek Lawson, a system that measures success by arrest numbers rather than community safety, a system that treats vulnerable citizens as targets rather than people to protect." "What do you hope to accomplish?" Cooper asked. "Justice. Not just for me, but for everyone Officer Lawson and officers like him have victimized. I want policy changes. I want accountability. I want every officer in this country to know that when they abuse their power, there will be consequences." The interview aired Wednesday night. By Thursday morning, 3 more victims had come forward. The first was Dorothy Harris, a 74-year-old retired teacher who Lawson had arrested 6 years earlier for suspicious behavior during a traffic stop. The charges had been dropped, but Dorothy had spent 18 hours in jail, missed her grandson's birthday party, and developed anxiety so severe she no longer drove at night. "I thought I was the only one," Dorothy told Rachel Torres. "I thought nobody would believe me if I said something, but when I saw Judge Coleman on the news, when I saw that she was fighting back, I knew I had to speak up too." The second was Marcus Williams, a 69-year-old veteran who Lawson had tackled to the ground outside a convenience store 3 years earlier. Marcus had been reaching for his wallet to show his military ID when Lawson slammed him face first into the pavement. The incident left Marcus with a broken nose and a permanent distrust of law enforcement. "I served this country for 20 years," Marcus said, "and this is how they treat me, like a criminal, like my service means nothing." The third victim was the one that broke the case wide open. Her name was Patricia Okonkwo. She was 34 years old, a nurse at Montgomery General Hospital, and she had evidence that no one could ignore. Patricia had been pulled over by Lawson 2 years earlier for a broken taillight. During the stop, Lawson had searched her car without consent, handcuffed her for resisting, and left her sitting on the side of the road for 2 hours while he verified her information. What Lawson didn't know was that Patricia's dashcam had recorded the entire encounter. The footage showed everything: Lawson's aggressive approach, his refusal to explain why she was being detained, his mocking comments about her attitude and her type, his threat to make things difficult if she filed a complaint. Patricia had kept the footage for 2 years, afraid to come forward. Now she handed it over to the FBI. When Agent Williams showed Margaret the video, she watched in silence. Theodore sat beside her, his jaw tight with anger. "This is exactly what he did to me," Margaret said when the video ended. "The same words, the same tactics. He's been doing this for years." "We know," Williams said, "and now we have proof." The video was released to the public on Friday morning. By Friday afternoon, Officer Derek Lawson had been arrested and charged with multiple counts of civil rights violations, false arrest, and conspiracy to deprive citizens of their constitutional rights. Margaret watched the news coverage from her living room, Theodore's hand in hers. On screen, Lawson was being led out of the police station in handcuffs, the same handcuffs he had used on Margaret, on Dorothy, on Marcus, on Patricia, on countless others. "How does it feel?" Theodore asked quietly. Margaret thought about the question. How did it feel to see the man who had humiliated her being led away in disgrace? "It feels like a beginning," she said finally. "Not an ending, a beginning." Theodore squeezed her hand. "There's more work to do." "Yes, much more." Because Lawson was just one officer, one symptom of a disease that ran through the entire department. Captain Morrison was still at his desk. The quota system was still in place. The culture that had enabled Lawson's abuse was still intact. Margaret had won a battle, but the war was far from over. Her phone buzzed. Another threatening text from another unknown number. "You think you've won. This is just getting started." Margaret showed it to Theodore. "They're scared," he said. "They should be." She looked at the television where analysts were discussing the implications of Lawson's arrest. They talked about reform, accountability, systemic change. They talked about Margaret like she was a hero. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a 72-year-old woman who was tired and angry and determined to see this through to the end. Her phone rang. Rachel Torres. "Judge Coleman, I have new information. Captain Morrison is trying to destroy evidence. We have a source inside the department." Margaret straightened. "What kind of evidence? Text messages, emails, performance reviews, everything that proves the quota system existed. He's ordering officers to delete their communications and reset their phones. Can you prove it? Our source is willing to testify, but we need to move fast. The longer we wait, the more evidence disappears." Margaret looked at Theodore. He nodded. "Set up a meeting," Margaret said. "Tonight, somewhere private." "Done." Margaret hung up and turned to her husband. "It's starting," she said. Theodore smiled, that old, fierce smile she had fallen in love with 49 years ago. "No," he said. "It started the moment that officer put his hands on you. This is just the next chapter." He was right. The next chapter. The one where the hunters became the hunted. Margaret looked out the window at the dark sedan still parked on the corner. Let them watch. Let them see that she wasn't afraid. She had spent 26 years fighting for justice from the bench. Now she was fighting from the streets, and she was just getting started. The meeting happened at 9:47 p.m. in the back room of a church 3 miles from Margaret's home. Rachel Torres was already there when Margaret arrived, sitting across from a young woman who couldn't have been more than 30. The woman's hands trembled around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. "Judge Coleman, this is Officer Denise Carter," Rachel said. "She's been with Montgomery PD for 7 years. She's ready to talk." Margaret sat down across from Denise. The young woman wouldn't meet her eyes. "You don't have to do this," Margaret said gently. "I know what you're risking." Denise finally looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed, exhausted. "Yes, I do. I've watched this happen for years. I've seen good people destroyed by bad officers. I've seen complaints buried, evidence disappear, victims silenced." Her voice cracked. "I became a cop to help people, not to be part of this." "Tell me what you know." Denise took a deep breath. "The quota system has been in place for at least 5 years. Captain Morrison implemented it when he took over the precinct. Officers are evaluated based on arrest numbers, not outcomes. If you don't hit your targets, you get passed over for promotions, stuck with bad shifts, assigned to the worst beats." And Lawson figured out the game faster than anyone. He learned to target people who wouldn't fight back. Elderly residents, minorities, people with mental health issues, homeless individuals. He called them easy stats. Denise's face twisted with disgust. He used to brag about it in the break room, how he could hit his quota by noon if he picked his targets right. Did anyone report him? 15 times, 15 formal complaints in 14 years. Every single one was dismissed by Internal Affairs. You know why? Denise leaned forward. Because Internal Affairs is run by Morrison's brother-in-law. The whole system is rigged to protect bad cops and punish anyone who speaks out. Margaret absorbed this information. It was worse than she'd imagined. "What about the evidence Rachel said Morrison is destroying records?" Denise nodded. "He sent out a memo yesterday. Everyone was ordered to delete text messages, emails, anything related to arrest quotas or performance metrics. He's calling it routine data management, but everyone knows what it really is." "Do you have copies?" Denise reached into her bag and pulled out a USB drive. 3 years of emails, text messages, performance reviews, and internal memos. Everything that proves the quota system existed and that Morrison knew about it. Margaret took the drive carefully like it was made of glass. "This is enough to bring down the entire department." "That's the idea," Denise's voice hardened. "I'm tired of being complicit. I'm tired of watching people like Lawson get away with abuse while the rest of us stay silent. When I saw what he did to you, an elderly woman, a federal judge, I knew I couldn't stay quiet anymore. You understand what this means for you, your career, your safety. My career is over either way. Morrison already suspects there's a leak. It's only a matter of time before he figures out it's me." Denise straightened her shoulders. "But I'd rather lose my badge with my integrity intact than keep it by staying silent." Margaret reached across the table and took Denise's hand. "You're braver than you know." "I'm not brave. I'm just tired of being afraid." Rachel had been recording the entire conversation. She stopped the recording and looked at Margaret. "What's our next move?" "We take this to the FBI, tonight, before Morrison has a chance to destroy anything else." Margaret called Agent Williams from the church parking lot. He answered on the first ring. "Judge Coleman, is everything all right?" "Better than all right? I have a whistleblower and 3 years of evidence proving systemic corruption in the Montgomery Police Department. I need you to come get it before it disappears." There was a pause. Then Williams said, "Give me your location. I'll have agents there in 20 minutes." The FBI arrived in 18. Agent Williams took the USB drive, interviewed Denise for 2 hours, and arranged for her immediate transfer to federal protective custody. By the time the sun rose on Saturday morning, the evidence was secured in an FBI facility, and Denise Carter was safely hidden in an undisclosed location. Margaret drove home as dawn broke over Montgomery. She was exhausted running on adrenaline and determination, but she also felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Theodore was awake when she walked through the door. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his legal pad surrounded by newspapers and printouts. "You look terrible," he said. "Thank you, darling." Did you get what you needed? Margaret sank into the chair across from him. We got everything. Emails, texts, memos, proof that Morrison ran a quota system and covered up abuse for years. The FBI has it all. Theodore's eyes lit up. Then it's over. Not yet. Morrison doesn't know we have this evidence. When he finds out, he's going to fight back hard. We need to be ready. What do you need from me? Margaret looked at her husband, this man who had stood beside her for 49 years, through triumphs and tragedies, through sickness and health. He looked tired, fragile, but his eyes burned with the same fire she had fallen in love with. I need you to rest. I need you to take care of yourself. Because when this goes to trial, I'm going to need you in that courtroom with me. Theodore smiled. Wild horses couldn't keep me away. Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. For a moment, they just sat there, two old warriors preparing for one last battle. The phone rang, shattering the silence. Margaret answered. Hello? Judge Coleman? The voice was female professional. This is Dr. Martinez from Montgomery General Hospital. I'm calling about your husband's medication. Margaret frowned. What about it? We received a request to cancel his prescription refill. I wanted to verify that the request came from you. Ice flooded Margaret's veins. I never made any such request. That's what I was afraid of. Someone called yesterday claiming to be you and asked us to discontinue all of Mr. Coleman's cardiac medications. Margaret's hand tightened on the phone. Someone tried to cancel my husband's heart medication. Theodore looked up sharply. Yes, ma'am. Fortunately, our protocol requires verbal confirmation from the patient or a verified family member. When we couldn't reach you, we flagged the request as suspicious. Thank God. Margaret's voice shook. Dr. Martinez, I need you to document this incident. Someone is trying to harm my husband by interfering with his medical care. I'll file a report immediately. And Judge Coleman, I've added extra verification requirements to your husband's account. No changes will be made without in-person confirmation from you or Mr. Coleman. Thank you. Margaret hung up and met Theodore's eyes. They tried to cancel your medication, she said. They're trying to kill you. Theodore's face went pale. Morrison. Who else? Margaret's hands trembled with rage. They can't intimidate me, so they're going after you. They think if they hurt you, I'll back down. Will you? Margaret's eyes hardened into something cold and dangerous. No, this just made it personal. She grabbed her phone and called Agent Williams again. Judge Coleman, did something happen? Someone tried to cancel my husband's cardiac medication. They impersonated me and called his doctor's office. If the hospital hadn't flagged the request, my husband could have died. Williams was silent for a moment. Then, this is attempted murder. We're escalating this case immediately. I want protection. Armed federal agents outside my home around the clock until this is over. Done. I'll have a detail there within the hour. And Williams, find out who made that call. I want them in handcuffs by the end of the day. Understood. Margaret hung up and turned to Theodore. He was still pale, still shaken, but there was something else in his eyes now. Anger. They came after me, he said quietly. They actually came after me. I'm sorry, Theo. I'm so sorry. I never thought they would... Don't apologize. Theodore's voice was fierce. This isn't your fault. This is their fault, and they're going to pay for it. Margaret pulled him into her arms and held him tight. She could feel his heart beating against her chest, that fragile, damaged heart that she had almost lost once already. They would not take him from her. Not like this. Not ever. The FBI protection detail arrived at 8:30 a.m. 2 agents in an unmarked car parked directly in front of the house. 2 more in the backyard, armed alert and ready for anything. The dark sedan that had been watching their home disappeared within minutes of the FBI's arrival. Good, Margaret thought. Let them run. Let them see that she wasn't alone anymore. By noon, the news broke that Captain Frank Morrison had been suspended pending investigation. The official statement cited administrative irregularities, but everyone knew the truth. The walls were closing in. Rachel Torres called at 2:00 p.m. with an update. Morrison's lawyer is already spinning. They're claiming the quota system was misunderstood and that Morrison was just trying to improve department efficiency. They're also starting a whisper campaign against you. What kind of whisper campaign? The usual. Questions about your mental state, suggestions that you've had a grudge against law enforcement for years, innuendos about your judicial record. Rachel paused. They're going to try to destroy your credibility before this goes to trial. Margaret laughed. It wasn't a pleasant sound. Let them try. I have 26 years of judicial decisions backing me up. Every ruling I ever made is public record. If they want to dig through my career, they'll find exactly what they're afraid of, a judge who consistently held corrupt officers accountable. I'll make sure that message gets out. In the meantime, we have another problem. What? The city council is meeting tomorrow night. Emergency session. Word is they're going to vote on whether to offer you a settlement. Big money, full public apology, in exchange for dropping your civil suit and ending your cooperation with the FBI. Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. They think they can buy me off. They think everyone has a price. They're wrong. I know, but you need to be there tomorrow night. You need to tell them yourself. Make them look you in the eye while they try to sweep this under the rug. I'll be there. Margaret hung up and found Theodore standing in the doorway. I heard, he said. They're offering a settlement. They're trying to make this go away. Pay me off and pretend it never happened. How much? Does it matter? Theodore studied her face for a long moment. Then he smiled. No, I suppose it doesn't. This was never about money. It was about justice. About making sure what happened to me never happens to anyone else. Margaret's voice hardened. I'm not going to let them buy their way out of accountability. Then we go to the city council meeting tomorrow. You think I'm letting you face them alone? Theodore shuffled toward her, his steps slow but determined. I've stood beside you for 49 years, Margaret Coleman. I'm not stopping now. She took his hand. The doctor said you need to avoid stress. The doctor can go to hell. My wife is fighting for justice, and I'm going to be there when she wins. Margaret laughed despite herself. You're a stubborn old man. I learned from the best. They held each other in the afternoon light, two people who had weathered storms and survived, who had loved each other through everything life had thrown at them. Tomorrow would bring another battle, but today they had each other. That was enough. Monday night arrived with a tension that Margaret could feel in her bones. The city council chamber was packed. Every seat was filled and people lined the walls 3 deep. News cameras crowded the back of the room. Outside, protesters had gathered, some supporting Margaret, others backing the police department. Margaret walked in at 6:55 p.m., Theodore on her arm. The crowd parted to let them through. Some people reached out to touch her hand, to whisper words of encouragement. Others glared with undisguised hostility. She kept her eyes forward. Show no fear. Maintain control. City Council Chairman Robert Hayes called the meeting to order at 7:00 p.m. sharp. This emergency session has been called to address the ongoing situation involving Judge Margaret Coleman and the Montgomery Police Department, Hayes announced. We have received a proposal for settlement that we will now discuss. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Hayes continued. The proposed settlement would provide Judge Coleman with substantial financial compensation, a public apology from the department, and the implementation of new oversight procedures. In exchange, Judge Coleman would drop her civil lawsuit and discontinue her cooperation with the federal investigation. Margaret stood. Mr. Chairman, I would like to address the council. Hayes hesitated. Judge Coleman, this is somewhat irregular. So is being handcuffed in a pharmacy for picking up my husband's heart medication. I believe I've earned the right to speak. The crowd erupted in applause. Hayes banged his gavel for order. Very well, you have 5 minutes. Margaret walked to the podium. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her supporters, skeptics' enemies. She could feel the cameras recording every word. Mr. Chairman, council members, citizens of Montgomery. Her voice was steady, clear, carrying to every corner of the chamber. I've been offered money to go away, to take a check, sign some papers, and pretend that what happened to me was an isolated incident. She paused, letting the words sink in. But it wasn't an isolated incident. Officer Derek Lawson didn't target me because I did something wrong. He targeted me because I was elderly, black, and alone, because he thought I was powerless, because he needed one more arrest to meet his quota. A wave of angry muttering swept through the crowd. I was lucky. I had the knowledge and the connections to fight back. But what about Dorothy Harris, who spent 18 hours in jail for a traffic stop? What about Marcus Williams, who was tackled to the ground outside a convenience store for reaching for his wallet? What about Patricia Okonkwo, whose dashcam footage proved what we all know, that this department has been systematically targeting vulnerable citizens for years? Margaret's voice rose. How many others are there? How many people were too scared to come forward? How many victims took settlements and signed NDAs and swallowed their trauma because they believed no one would listen? She turned to face the council directly. You're offering me money to make this go away. But money won't bring back Dorothy Harris's sense of safety. Money won't heal Marcus Williams's broken nose. Money won't undo the years of abuse that this department has inflicted on the people it was supposed to protect. Margaret planted her hands on the podium. I don't want your money. I want accountability. I want every officer who abused their power to face consequences. I want every supervisor who looked the other way to answer for their complicity. I want this department torn down to its foundation and rebuilt from the ground up. The crowd was on its feet now. Applause thundered through the chamber. And if this council thinks it can buy my silence... Margaret's eyes swept the room, landing on each council member in turn. Then you don't know me at all. She returned to her seat. Theodore squeezed her hand. That was beautiful, he whispered. Chairman Hayes banged his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. It took several minutes before the crowd finally settled. Judge Coleman has made her position clear. Hayes said, his face flushed. We will now hear from other parties. Captain Morrison's legal representative has asked to address the council. A man in an expensive suit rose from the front row. Margaret recognized him, David Crawford, one of the most aggressive defense attorneys in the state. His presence here meant Morrison was pulling out all the stops. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Crawford's voice was smooth, practiced. I appreciate the passion Judge Coleman has demonstrated tonight, but passion isn't evidence. And I'm afraid the narrative she's presented doesn't align with the facts. Margaret's eyes narrowed. The Montgomery Police Department has served this community for over 100 years. Are there problems? Of course. Every institution has problems. But the suggestion that there's some kind of systematic conspiracy to target elderly citizens is frankly absurd. Then explain the quota system, Margaret called out. Hayes banged his gavel. Judge Coleman, you've had your turn. No, it's all right, Crawford said, smiling. I'm happy to address the judge's concerns. The so-called quota system was nothing more than a performance evaluation tool. Every business, every organization uses metrics to assess employee performance. Suggesting that this somehow encouraged officers to target innocent citizens is a gross misrepresentation. Is it? Margaret stood again. Then explain Officer Lawson's text messages. The ones where he called me an easy target. The ones where he bragged about meeting his quota by noon if he picked his targets right. Crawford's smile flickered. Those messages are unverified. They're verified by the FBI. They're part of an ongoing federal investigation. And they prove exactly what I've been saying, that officers in this department were incentivized to make arrests, regardless of whether those arrests were justified. Judge Coleman, Officer Lawson didn't arrest me because I did anything wrong. He arrested me because I was a 72-year-old black woman and he thought I wouldn't fight back. Margaret's voice cracked with emotion. He called me Grandma. He twisted my arm behind my back. He put me in handcuffs so tight they left bruises. And when I told him he was making a mistake, he said I needed to learn my place. The crowd erupted again. This time Hayes didn't try to restore order. My place, Margaret repeated, her voice rising above the noise. A federal judge with 26 years on the bench, a woman who has dedicated her entire life to justice. And this officer thought my place was in the back of his patrol car, humiliated and degraded because of the color of my skin. She turned to face Crawford directly. That's not a performance metric, Mr. Crawford. That's racism. And no amount of legal spin is going to change that. Crawford's face had gone pale. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, a commotion erupted at the back of the chamber. "Let me through, I have something to say." The crowd parted to reveal a woman Margaret didn't recognize, middle-aged, dressed in nurse's scrubs, her face streaked with tears. "Who are you?" Hayes demanded. "My name is Linda Morrison." The woman's voice shook. "Frank Morrison is my brother, and I can't stay silent anymore." The chamber went deadly quiet. Linda walked to the front of the room, her steps unsteady. "I've watched my brother run this department for years. I've heard him talk about the quota system like it was a game. I've heard him laugh about the complaints that got buried. I've heard him brag about how untouchable he was." She turned to face the council. "But when I saw what happened to Judge Coleman, when I saw an elderly woman being brutalized for picking up medication, I couldn't pretend anymore." Linda reached into her purse and pulled out a stack of papers. "These are copies of internal memos my brother wrote. Memos ordering officers to increase arrest numbers. Memos instructing internal affairs to dismiss complaints. Memos specifically targeting high-value demographics, his words for increased enforcement." She threw the papers onto the council table. "This is who my brother really is, and I'm done protecting him." The chamber exploded into chaos. Hayes banged his gavel uselessly. Reporters shouted questions. Council members stared at the documents in disbelief. Crawford was on his phone, his face ashen. Margaret sat perfectly still, watching Linda Morrison sob as security escorted her from the chamber. She felt Theodore's hand in hers, warm and steady. "My God," Theodore whispered, "his own sister." "She did the right thing," Margaret said quietly, "even though it cost her everything." The meeting devolved into pandemonium. Hayes eventually called a recess, but the damage was done. The evidence Linda had provided was devastating internal documents, proving that Morrison had orchestrated a systematic campaign of abuse and cover-up. By the time Margaret and Theodore made it to their car, the news had already spread. Every channel was covering the story. "Captain's sister provides damning evidence." "Morrison conspiracy confirmed." "Judge Coleman vindicated." Margaret's phone rang. "Agent Williams." "Judge Coleman, we're moving on Morrison tonight. The evidence his sister provided combined with what we already had, it's enough for an arrest." "What are the charges?" "Conspiracy to deprive citizens of civil rights, obstruction of justice, witness tampering, attempted murder for the medication incident." Williams paused. "And that's just the beginning. We're looking at a RICO case that could bring down half the department." Margaret closed her eyes. Tonight, I wanted you to know before you see it on the news." "Thank you, Agent Williams." "Thank you, Judge Coleman. Without your courage, none of this would have been possible." Margaret hung up and turned to Theodore. "They're arresting Morrison tonight." Theodore's eyes widened. "It's really happening. It's really happening." For a moment, they just sat in the car processing the magnitude of what they had accomplished. A week ago, Margaret had been an anonymous retiree picking up her husband's medication. Now she had brought down a corrupt police captain and exposed a system of abuse that had victimized hundreds. "I'm proud of you, Maggie," Theodore said softly. "I couldn't have done it without you." "Yes, you could have. You've always been the strong one." Margaret shook her head. "No, I've always had you. That's what made me strong." Theodore reached over and cupped her face in his hands. His touch was gentle, his eyes filled with 49 years of love. "We make a good team," he said. "The best." He kissed her, then softly, tenderly. When they pulled apart, Margaret could see tears in his eyes. "Let's go home," she said. "Let's go home." They drove through the Montgomery streets as sirens wailed in the distance. Somewhere across town, federal agents were moving on Captain Morrison's house. Somewhere a corrupt system was finally facing consequences. But in this car, in this moment, there was just Margaret and Theodore, two people who had fought for justice and won, at least for tonight. The arrest happened at 11:47 p.m. Margaret watched the live coverage from her living room, Theodore dozing beside her on the couch. On screen, Captain Frank Morrison was being led out of his home in handcuffs, his face a mask of fury. "Captain Morrison," a reporter shouted, "do you have any comment on the charges?" Morrison stopped and stared directly into the camera. For a moment, Margaret felt his eyes boring into her through the screen. "This isn't over," he said. "This is just the beginning." Then the agents pushed him into the waiting vehicle, and he was gone. Margaret turned off the television and sat in the darkness for a long time. Morrison's words echoed in her mind. "This isn't over. This is just the beginning." He was right. The arrest was just one step. There would be trials, appeals, political battles. There would be pushback from the police union, from Morrison's allies, from everyone who had benefited from the corrupt system. But Margaret wasn't afraid. She had faced down more dangerous enemies than Frank Morrison. She had spent 26 years in the arena of justice, fighting battles that others thought unwinnable. This was just one more fight, and she intended to win it. Theodore stirred beside her. "Maggie, is it over?" She looked at her husband, this man who had stood beside her, through everything, who had believed in her, when she didn't believe in herself, who had given her the strength to keep fighting. "Not yet," she said softly. "But we're winning." Theodore smiled and closed his eyes again. Within moments, he was asleep. Margaret stayed awake, watching over him in the darkness. Outside, she could hear the FBI agents talking quietly, keeping watch, keeping them safe. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles, new enemies. But tonight they had won, and that was enough. The morning after Morrison's arrest brought a storm that Margaret hadn't anticipated. She woke to the sound of her phone buzzing relentlessly on the nightstand. 17 missed calls, 43 text messages. Her email inbox had overflowed overnight. Theodore was still asleep, his breathing shallow but steady. Margaret slipped out of bed and made her way to the kitchen, scrolling through the messages as she went. Most were congratulations, support from former colleagues, old friends, strangers who had seen the news. But scattered among them were darker messages, threats, warnings, promises of retaliation. "You think you've won? You've just made enemies you can't imagine. Morrison has friends in high places. Watch your back. Your husband won't live to see the trial." Margaret's hands trembled as she read the last message. She took a screenshot and forwarded it to Agent Williams, then deleted it from her phone. Theodore didn't need to see that. The kitchen television was still on from the night before, muted, but showing the morning news. Margaret unmuted it and watched as anchors discussed Morrison's arrest. "Captain Frank Morrison appeared in federal court this morning for his initial hearing," the anchor reported. "He pleaded not guilty to all charges and was released on $2 million bail." Margaret's blood ran cold. Released. They had released him. Her phone rang. "Agent Williams, I just saw the news," she said before he could speak. "How is he out already?" The judge determined he wasn't a flight risk. $2 million bail, ankle monitor, passport surrendered. It's standard procedure for white-collar defendants. "This isn't white-collar crime. He tried to have my husband killed." "I know. We argued against bail, but the judge wasn't convinced. Morrison has deep roots in this community. 30 years of service, character witnesses lined up around the block." Margaret laughed bitterly. "Character witnesses for a man who ran a corruption ring. Welcome to the justice system, Judge. You know better than anyone how it works." Yes, she did know. She had seen guilty men walk free on technicalities. She had watched victims be re-traumatized by the legal process. She had spent 26 years trying to make the system work, knowing that it often failed the people who needed it most. "What happens now?" she asked. "Trial is set for 3 months from now. In the meantime, Morrison's lawyers will do everything they can to discredit you, the evidence, and anyone else involved in this case. They're going to make the next 90 days hell. I've survived worse." "I know you have. But Judge Coleman—" Williams paused. "Be careful. Morrison has nothing left to lose. That makes him dangerous." Margaret hung up and stared at the television where Morrison's lawyer was now giving a press conference. "My client is innocent of all charges," David Crawford declared. "He is the victim of a politically motivated witch hunt orchestrated by a disgruntled former judge with a personal vendetta against law enforcement. We look forward to clearing his name in court." Margaret turned off the television. She had heard enough. Theodore shuffled into the kitchen 10 minutes later, his bathrobe hanging loose on his thinning frame. I heard the news, he said. Morrison made bail. Yes. How are you feeling? Margaret poured him a cup of coffee and set it on the table. Angry, frustrated, determined. Theodore sat down heavily. That sounds about right. They're going to come after me, Theo. Morrison's lawyers, the police union, everyone who has something to lose if this case goes forward. They're going to try to destroy my reputation. Let them try. Theodore's voice was fierce despite its weakness. They don't know who they're dealing with. I'm 72 years old. I'm tired. And I'm scared. Margaret's voice cracked. Not for myself, for you. That message about your medication, they're not going to stop. They're going to keep coming after you to get to me. Theodore reached across the table and took her hand. Then we fight together, like we always have. What if fighting costs me you? The question hung in the air between them. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, tears she had been holding back since this nightmare began. Maggie. Theodore's grip tightened on her hand. Look at me. She met his eyes. I'm not going anywhere. Not because of Morrison, not because of his threats, not because of anything. I've been by your side for 49 years, and I'm going to be by your side for 49 more if God allows it. The doctor said stress. The doctor said a lot of things, but you know what keeps my heart beating, you? Fighting for what's right, seeing justice done. Theodore's eyes glistened. If you back down now, if you let them win, that's what would kill me, not the stress, the surrender. Margaret stood and walked around the table to hold her husband. She pressed her face against his shoulder and let the tears come. I'm so scared, Theo. I know, so am I, but we've faced worse, haven't we? Remember when they threatened you during the Castellano trial? Remember the death threats during the Mitchell case? That was different. I was younger, stronger. You're the same woman you've always been. The same woman who stood in a pharmacy and told a corrupt officer that he was making a mistake. The same woman who looked into television cameras and demanded justice. The same woman I fell in love with 50 years ago. Theodore pulled back and cupped her face in his hands. That woman doesn't surrender. That woman fights, and that woman wins. Margaret wiped her eyes and took a deep breath. You're right. I know you're right. Of course I'm right. I'm always right. Theodore smiled. Now make me breakfast. We have a war to win. Despite everything, Margaret laughed. The war began in earnest the next day. Crawford filed a motion to dismiss all charges, citing prosecutorial overreach and insufficient evidence. The motion was denied, but it was just the opening salvo. Next came the media campaign. Morrison's allies flooded the airwaves with attacks on Margaret's character. Former defendants she had sentenced decades ago were paraded out to call her harsh, biased, vengeful. Conservative commentators painted her as a radical activist judge who had manufactured a controversy to attack law enforcement. Judge Coleman has a documented history of anti-police bias, one pundit declared on Fox News. This is nothing more than a personal vendetta disguised as a civil rights case. Rachel Torres called Margaret that evening. They're trying to control the narrative. We need to push back. How? More interviews? More victims coming forward. We need to remind people what this case is really about. Not politics, not ideology, but justice for ordinary people who were brutalized by corrupt officers. I'm not sure how many more interviews I can do. Theodore's health. I know. But Judge Coleman, if we lose the public relations battle, we lose everything. Morrison's lawyers are counting on people to forget what he did. We can't let that happen. Margaret rubbed her temples. Set up the interviews. I'll do them. Thank you. And Judge Coleman, for what it's worth, you're winning. The polls show overwhelming public support for your case. People believe you. Polls don't matter in a courtroom. No, but they matter everywhere else. Margaret hung up and found Theodore watching her from his chair. More interviews? He asked. More interviews. Then I'm coming with you. Theo, your health. My health is my business. Theodore's voice was firm. You're not facing this alone. End of discussion. Margaret knew better than to argue. The next 3 weeks were a blur of television appearances, newspaper interviews, and public events. Margaret told her story over and over until the words lost all meaning. Theodore sat beside her through every interview, a silent pillar of strength, but the strain was taking its toll. Margaret noticed it first in the small things. Theodore's hands trembled more than usual. His appetite disappeared. He slept 14 hours a day and still woke exhausted. "I'm fine," he insisted whenever she asked. "Just tired." But Margaret knew her husband. She knew when he was hiding pain, and she knew that this fight was killing him slowly, one interview at a time. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon. They were at a television studio preparing for another interview when Theodore suddenly clutched his chest and collapsed. "Theo!" Margaret screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. "Someone call 911!" The studio erupted into chaos. Producers shouted for help. A security guard ran for the phone. Margaret cradled Theodore's head in her lap, watching his face turn gray. "Stay with me," she begged. "Please, Theo, stay with me." His eyes fluttered open. "Maggie, don't talk. Help is coming. Just hold on. I love you." His voice was barely a whisper. "I've always loved you. I love you too. Now stop talking and save your strength." The paramedics arrived in 7 minutes. They worked on Theodore right there on the studio floor, attaching monitors and administering medication. Margaret watched helplessly, her heart shattering with every beep of the machine. "We need to get him to the hospital," one paramedic said. "He's having a cardiac event." "Is he going to be okay?" The paramedic's face was carefully neutral. "We're doing everything we can, ma'am." They loaded Theodore onto a stretcher and rushed him to the ambulance. Margaret climbed in beside him, clutching his hand as they raced through the Montgomery streets. "Hang on, Theo. Please hang on." Theodore's eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. The monitor beside him beeped erratically, each sound a reminder of how fragile life really was. Margaret had never felt so helpless. She had faced down corrupt officers, challenged powerful institutions, spoken truth to power. But she couldn't fight this. She couldn't argue her way out of a failing heart. All she could do was hold her husband's hand and pray. The emergency room was controlled chaos. Doctors and nurses swarmed around Theodore, shouting orders and administering treatments. Margaret was pushed into a waiting room alone with her terror. Agent Williams arrived 20 minutes later. "I heard what happened. How is he?" "I don't know. They won't tell me anything." Margaret's voice broke. "This is my fault. The stress of all this, the interviews, the threats, the constant pressure, it was too much for him." "This isn't your fault." "Yes, it is. He told me he was fine, and I believed him because I wanted to believe him, because I needed him beside me." Tears streamed down Margaret's face. "I put my mission ahead of my husband's health. What kind of wife does that?" Williams sat down beside her. "Judge Coleman, your husband chose to stand with you. That was his decision, not yours. He knew the risks, and he chose to fight anyway. And now he might die because of it. He might live because of it too. Because of what you're fighting for. Because of what both of you are fighting for." Williams paused. "I've seen a lot of cases in my career. I've seen a lot of people try to take on corrupt systems and fail. But I've never seen anyone with the courage you and your husband have shown. That matters. It matters more than you know." Margaret wiped her eyes. "I can't lose him." "Then don't. Be there when he wakes up. Be there when he recovers. Be there to fight alongside him just like you've always been." A doctor appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Coleman." Margaret jumped to her feet. "Yes, how is he?" The doctor's face was serious but not grave. "Your husband had a significant cardiac event. We've stabilized him for now, but his heart is weak. The stress he's been under has taken a serious toll." "Is he going to be okay?" "He's going to need surgery, a bypass to repair the damaged tissue. Without it, he won't survive another event like this." Margaret felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. "When, as soon as possible, tomorrow morning ideally. The longer we wait, the greater the risk." "Can I see him?" "He's sedated, but yes, follow me." Margaret followed the doctor through a maze of corridors to a private room. Theodore lay in the hospital bed surrounded by monitors and IV lines. He looked small, fragile, nothing like the fierce man who had stood beside her through everything. She sat down beside him and took his hand. "I'm here, Theo. I'm right here." His fingers twitched slightly in response. "They're going to fix you up." Margaret continued, her voice trembling. "Surgery tomorrow. And then you're going to recover, and we're going to finish this fight together, just like you promised." She leaned forward and pressed her lips to his forehead. "I need you to be strong, Theo. I need you to fight, because I can't do this without you. I've never been able to do anything without you." The monitors beeped steadily. Theodore's chest rose and fell with each breath. Margaret stayed by his side all night, watching over him, praying for the first time in decades. The surgery happened at 7:00 a.m. Margaret sat in the waiting room, surrounded by people who had come to support her. Rachel Torres was there, Agent Williams, Dorothy Harris, Marcus Williams, Patricia Okonkwo, the other victims who had become her allies. Judge Patricia Morrison had flown in from Howard Law School. They sat in silence, waiting for news. At 11:42 a.m., the surgeon emerged. Margaret stood, her heart pounding. "Doctor." The surgeon smiled. "The surgery was successful. We repaired the damage and restored blood flow to the affected areas. Your husband is in recovery now." Margaret's knees nearly buckled with relief. "He's going to be okay." "He's going to need time to heal. Weeks, maybe months of careful recovery. But yes, Mrs. Coleman, he's going to be okay." The waiting room erupted in cheers. Dorothy Harris embraced Margaret. Patricia Morrison wiped tears from her eyes. Even Agent Williams looked moved. But Margaret barely heard any of it. She was already moving toward the recovery room, toward Theodore, toward the man she had loved for 49 years. He was awake when she reached him. "Maggie." His voice was weak, but his eyes were clear. "You stubborn old man." Margaret laughed through her tears. "You scared me half to death." "Sorry about that." Theodore managed a small smile. "Didn't mean to steal your spotlight." "You never could resist being the center of attention." She sat beside him and took his hand. For a long moment they just looked at each other, two people who had nearly lost everything and found their way back. "The doctor says you need to rest," Margaret said finally. "Weeks of recovery, no stress, no excitement, no fighting corrupt police departments." Theodore's eyes narrowed. "Maggie, I mean it, Theo. I mean it. Your health comes first. The case can wait." "The case can't wait. Morrison's trial is in 2 months. If you back off now..." "Then I back off. You almost died, Theo. Nothing is worth losing you. Nothing." Theodore was quiet for a moment. Then he squeezed her hand. "I've been thinking," he said slowly. "While I was lying there waiting for surgery, I've been thinking about what really matters. And you matter, justice matters. But I realized something else too." Theodore's eyes met hers. "I've been holding you back." "What? No." "Yes, I have. You've been worried about me taking care of me, protecting me from stress, and it's kept you from fighting as hard as you could." Theodore's voice grew stronger. "You need to finish this, Maggie. Not for me. For everyone who's been hurt by officers like Lawson. For everyone who's still afraid to speak up. I can't leave you. I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to be right here recovering, watching you on television, cheering you on." Theodore smiled. "And when you win, because you will win, I'm going to be the first one to say I told you so." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. "You're impossible." "I learned from the best." She leaned forward and kissed him gently, tenderly. "I love you, Theodore Coleman." "I love you too, Margaret Coleman. Now go finish what you started." Margaret left the hospital that afternoon with a new fire burning in her chest. Theodore was right. She had been holding back, afraid of what the fight might cost him. But that fear had nearly cost her everything anyway. No more holding back, no more compromise, no more fear. She called Rachel Torres from the car. "Schedule a press conference tomorrow morning. I have something to say." "What kind of something?" "The kind that's going to blow this case wide open." And the press conference happened at 10:00 a.m. on the steps of the federal courthouse. Every major news outlet was there. Cameras stretched in a semicircle around the podium where Margaret stood, flanked by the other victims and their lawyers. "Thank you all for coming," Margaret began. "As many of you know, my husband Theodore suffered a cardiac event earlier this week. He's recovering now, but this experience has reminded me of what's really at stake in this fight." She paused, looking out at the sea of cameras. For the past several weeks, I've been attacked by people who want this case to go away. They've questioned my motives, my integrity, my sanity. They've tried to paint me as a bitter old woman with a grudge against law enforcement. Margaret's voice hardened. But I'm not the story here. The story is the hundreds of people who have been brutalized by officers like Derek Lawson. The story is the system that protected those officers and silenced their victims. The story is the corruption that has infected the Montgomery Police Department for decades. She gestured to the people standing behind her. These are some of the victims: Dorothy Harris, Marcus Williams, Patricia Okonkwo. But there are many more. Today we're announcing that 47 additional victims have come forward with allegations of abuse, false arrest, and civil rights violations. 47 people who were afraid to speak up until now. The crowd of reporters murmured with shock. We are filing a class action lawsuit against the City of Montgomery, the Montgomery Police Department, Captain Frank Morrison, Officer Derek Lawson, and every other officer involved in this conspiracy. We are seeking damages, policy reforms, and criminal prosecution for everyone responsible. Margaret looked directly into the cameras. This is not a personal vendetta. This is not a political statement. This is a demand for justice. And we will not rest until every victim has been heard, every perpetrator has been held accountable, and every citizen of Montgomery can trust that their police department serves and protects rather than targets and abuses. She stepped back from the podium. The reporters erupted with questions, but Margaret was already walking away, surrounded by her allies. Rachel Torres caught up with her at the courthouse doors. That was incredible. The phones are already blowing up. Every news outlet in the country wants an interview. Set them up, all of them. Are you sure? After what happened to Theodore, Margaret stopped and turned to face Rachel. My husband almost died because of the stress this fight has caused, but he told me something in that hospital room. He told me to finish what I started. He told me that backing down would be worse than any risk to his health. Margaret's eyes burned with determination. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to finish this. For Theodore. For all the victims. For everyone who's ever been afraid to stand up to power. Rachel nodded slowly. Then let's finish it together. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Margaret gave interview after interview telling her story, amplifying the voices of other victims, keeping the pressure on Morrison and his allies. The class action lawsuit grew as more victims came forward, 52, then 68, then 83. Theodore recovered slowly but steadily. He watched the coverage from his hospital bed, then from home, cheering Margaret on with every victory. Morrison's lawyers fought back with everything they had. They filed motion after motion, trying to delay the trial, suppress evidence, discredit witnesses. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the public support was undeniable. Finally, 6 weeks after Margaret's press conference, the judge denied Morrison's final motion to dismiss. The trial would proceed. Margaret got the news while sitting with Theodore in their living room. She hung up the phone and turned to her husband. It's happening. The trial starts in 2 weeks. Theodore smiled that old, fierce smile she had fallen in love with. Then let's get ready. You're not coming to court. Doctor's orders. Doctor's orders can go to hell. You think I'm going to miss the moment you bring down the whole corrupt system? Theodore shook his head. I'll be there, Maggie, in a wheelchair if I have to. Margaret knew better than to argue. The night before the trial, Margaret sat alone in her study, reviewing her notes for the 100th time. Everything they had fought for came down to this. All the interviews, all the threats, all the sacrifices. Tomorrow, a jury would decide whether justice would be served or whether corruption would win again. Theodore appeared in the doorway. You should be sleeping, Margaret said. So should you. And he shuffled across the room and sat down in the chair beside her desk. Are you ready? Margaret set down her notes. I've been ready for this my whole life. 26 years on the bench preparing for one final case, the case that matters most. You're going to win. I hope so. No. Theodore's voice was firm. You're going to win because you're Margaret Coleman, because you've never lost a fight that mattered, and because you have the truth on your side. Margaret reached for his hand. What if the truth isn't enough? Then we make it enough. We fight harder. We speak louder. We refuse to give up until every last person in that courtroom understands what happened and why it matters. Theodore squeezed her hand. You taught me something, Maggie. In all our years together, you taught me that justice isn't something that happens to us. It's something we create, through courage, through persistence, through refusing to accept injustice as inevitable. And his eyes glistened. Tomorrow you're going to walk into that courtroom and create justice. Not just for yourself, for Dorothy and Marcus and Patricia, for the 47 victims who finally found their voices, for everyone who ever looked at a corrupt system and wondered if change was possible. Margaret felt tears threatening. I'm scared, Theo. Good. Fear means you care. Fear means you understand what's at stake. Theodore pulled her close. But don't let fear stop you. Let it drive you. Let it remind you why this matters. They held each other in the quiet study, surrounded by years of legal books and case files. Tomorrow, everything would change. But tonight, they had each other. And that was enough. The federal courthouse stood silent in the early morning light as Margaret and Theodore arrived at 7:30 a.m. Theodore moved slowly, his cane tapping against the marble steps, but his eyes were clear and determined. Margaret held his arm, steadying him, feeling the slight tremor in his muscles with each step. You don't have to do this, she said quietly. We've had this conversation, Maggie. I'm here. End of discussion. They reached the courthouse doors. A crowd had already gathered, supporters holding signs, reporters setting up cameras, curious onlookers hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman who had taken on the entire police department. Judge Coleman, a reporter shouted. How are you feeling about the trial? Margaret paused at the top of the steps and turned to face the cameras. I feel ready, I feel determined, and I feel grateful for everyone who has supported us through this journey. She squeezed Theodore's hand. Today isn't just about me. It's about every person who has ever been victimized by abuse of power. Today, we demand accountability. She turned and walked through the doors, Theodore beside her. The courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled. People stood along the walls. The air crackled with tension and anticipation. Margaret made her way to the plaintiff's table where her legal team was already assembled. Theodore took a seat directly behind her in the front row of the gallery. Across the aisle, Captain Frank Morrison sat with his lawyers. He looked older than Margaret remembered, grayer, more worn, but his eyes still held that cold defiance she had seen in countless defendants over her 26 years on the bench. Their eyes met across the courtroom. Morrison smiled, a thin, contemptuous expression that made Margaret's blood boil. She turned away. All rise. The United States District Court for the Middle District of Alabama is now in session. The Honorable Judge William Patterson presiding. Judge Patterson entered and took his seat. He was a stern man in his 60s, known for his no-nonsense approach and his intolerance for grandstanding. Be seated. We are here for the matter of Coleman et al. Versus the City of Montgomery, the Montgomery Police Department, Captain Frank Morrison, Officer Derek Lawson, and others. This is a civil rights case alleging systematic abuse, false arrest, and conspiracy to deprive citizens of their constitutional rights. Patterson looked over his glasses at both tables. Counsel, are you ready to proceed? The lead plaintiff's attorney, James Foster, stood. Ready, Your Honor. David Crawford rose from the defense table. Ready, Your Honor. Very well. Mr. Foster, your opening statement. James Foster walked to the jury box. He was a tall, distinguished black man in his early 60s with a voice that commanded attention. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about power. The power that police officers hold over ordinary citizens. The power to protect or the power to destroy. He paused, letting the words sink in. Judge Margaret Coleman is 72 years old. She served on the federal bench for 26 years. She dedicated her life to justice. And on a Tuesday afternoon, she walked into a pharmacy to pick up her husband's heart medication. Foster's voice hardened. She was doing nothing wrong. She had every legal right to be there to pick up that prescription to go home to her husband, who needed that medication to stay alive. But Officer Derek Lawson didn't see a law-abiding citizen. He saw a target. He pointed at Lawson, who sat stone-faced at the defense table. Officer Lawson arrested Judge Coleman because she was elderly, black, and alone. He handcuffed her, humiliated her, and threw her into the back of his patrol car while dozens of witnesses recorded his abuse. And why? Because he needed one more arrest to meet his quota. Foster turned back to the jury. This case isn't just about what happened to Judge Coleman. It's about what happened to Dorothy Harris, who was arrested during a traffic stop and spent 18 hours in jail for no reason. It's about Marcus Williams, a decorated veteran who was tackled to the ground for reaching for his wallet. It's about Patricia Okonkwo, whose dashcam footage proved what we all know, that the Montgomery Police Department has been systematically targeting vulnerable citizens for years. He walked slowly past the jury box, making eye contact with each juror. 83 victims have come forward, 83 people who were afraid to speak up until Judge Coleman showed them that it was possible to fight back. 83 stories of abuse, intimidation, and injustice. Foster's voice dropped low. We will present evidence proving that Captain Frank Morrison implemented a quota system that incentivized officers to make arrests regardless of whether crimes had been committed. We will show that complaints against officers like Lawson were systematically buried by an internal affairs department controlled by Morrison's allies. We will demonstrate a conspiracy to deprive citizens of their constitutional rights, a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of the Montgomery Police Department. He returned to the plaintiff's table. At the end of this trial, we will ask you to send a message that abuse of power has consequences. A message that no badge, no uniform, no position of authority exempts anyone from accountability. A message that in America, justice is not just a word, it's a promise. Foster sat down. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. David Crawford rose slowly, buttoning his jacket as he approached the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Foster tells a compelling story. Dramatic, emotional, the stuff of movies and television. Crawford smiled. But stories aren't evidence. And when you look at the actual evidence in this case, you'll find something very different from what Mr. Foster has described. Crawford's voice was smooth, reasonable. Judge Coleman was not arrested because of her race or her age. She was briefly detained because she exhibited behavior that Officer Lawson, based on his training and experience, found suspicious. Was he wrong? Yes. Did he make a mistake? Absolutely. But a mistake is not the same as a conspiracy. He gestured toward Morrison. Captain Morrison is a 30-year veteran of law enforcement. He has dedicated his life to protecting the citizens of Montgomery. The so-called quota system was nothing more than a performance evaluation tool, the same kind used by every business and organization in America. To suggest that this somehow encouraged officers to target innocent citizens is not just wrong, it's insulting to the men and women who risk their lives every day to keep us safe. Crawford walked toward the jury box. The plaintiffs will parade victim after victim before you, each with their own story of alleged abuse. But ask yourself, where is the evidence? Where is the proof that these arrests were unjustified? Where is the documentation showing that Captain Morrison ordered his officers to target elderly citizens or minorities? He paused dramatically. It doesn't exist. Because this case isn't about evidence, it's about emotion. It's about exploiting the current political climate to score points against law enforcement. It's about a disgruntled former judge who couldn't accept that she was treated like any other citizen during a police encounter. Crawford's eyes swept the jury. Don't be fooled by dramatic storytelling. Look at the facts. Follow the evidence. And when you do, you'll reach the only conclusion supported by that evidence that my clients are innocent of these charges. He returned to his seat. Margaret felt Theodore's hand on her shoulder. She reached up and covered it with her own. The battle had begun. The first week of trial was devoted to establishing the facts of Margaret's arrest. The prosecution played cell phone footage from multiple angles, each showing the same brutal scene, an elderly woman being handcuffed and forced into a patrol car, while onlookers protested. They played Lawson's body camera footage, which showed his aggressive approach and contemptuous tone. They introduced his text messages, in which he described Margaret as an easy target and bragged about meeting his quota. Lawson took the stand on day 3. James Foster approached him slowly, deliberately. "Officer Lawson, on the afternoon of the incident, you sent a text message to your partner describing Judge Coleman as, quote, elderly, black, female, easy target. Is that correct?" Lawson's jaw tightened. "That's what the message said." "And what did you mean by easy target?" "I meant she fit the profile of someone who might be engaged in prescription fraud." "The profile, is there a specific profile for prescription fraud that includes being elderly and black?" Crawford jumped up. "Objection, leading." "Sustained," Foster nodded. "Let me rephrase. Officer Lawson, what specific behaviors did Judge Coleman exhibit that made you suspect prescription fraud?" "She was taking too long at the counter, reading the medication bottle too carefully, acting nervous." "Acting nervous. You mean the nervousness anyone might feel when a police officer approaches them uninvited in a pharmacy?" "Objection. Withdrawn. Officer Lawson, did you run Judge Coleman's name through your database before arresting her?" "No." "Did you ask for her identification?" "She reached for her purse." "Did you ask to see her identification before placing her in handcuffs?" Lawson hesitated. "No." "Did you ask the pharmacy staff if they recognized her as a regular customer?" The pharmacy manager tried to interfere. "Yes or no, Officer Lawson? Did you ask the pharmacy staff if they recognized Judge Coleman?" "No." "So you arrested a 72-year-old woman, handcuffed her in front of dozens of witnesses, and placed her in your patrol car, all without verifying her identity, checking her prescription records, or consulting with pharmacy staff who could have confirmed she was a legitimate customer." "I was following my training." "Your training told you to arrest elderly women without evidence. Your training told you to call suspects grandma and tell them to learn their place." Crawford was on his feet. "Objection, counsel is badgering the witness." "Sustained. Mr. Foster, move on." Foster nodded, but his point had been made. He turned to the jury, letting them see Lawson's discomfort before continuing. "Officer Lawson, you testified that you were following training. Whose training specifically?" "Department training, standard procedures. Procedures established by Captain Morrison." Lawson glanced at the defense table. "Yes." "And were these procedures ever put in writing? Were they documented anywhere?" "They were communicated verbally at briefings." "Verbal instructions, nothing in writing." Foster paused. "Convenient." "Objection. Withdrawn." Margaret watched Lawson squirm on the witness stand. The man who had humiliated her, who had treated her like a criminal, was finally facing consequences. But she felt no satisfaction, only a grim determination to see this through. The trial continued through week 2. Dorothy Harris testified about her 18-hour detention following a traffic stop. Marcus Williams described being tackled to the ground outside a convenience store. Patricia Okonkwo's dashcam footage played on the courtroom screens, showing Lawson threatening her with vague consequences if she filed a complaint. Victim after victim took the stand. 83 stories of abuse, humiliation, and injustice. The jury listened, their faces growing more troubled with each testimony. Then came the moment Margaret had been waiting for. The prosecution calls Judge Margaret Coleman to the stand. Margaret rose slowly. Theodore caught her hand as she passed. "You've got this," he whispered. She walked to the witness stand, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. Then she sat down and faced the jury. James Foster approached. "Judge Coleman, please describe what happened on the afternoon of the incident." Margaret took a deep breath. "I went to Riverside Pharmacy to pick up my husband's heart medication. He'd had a stroke 4 months earlier, and his cardiologist had been very clear that missing even 1 dose could be dangerous." "What happened when you arrived at the pharmacy?" "I waited in line like everyone else. When it was my turn, I approached the counter and gave the pharmacist my husband's prescription information. I had his insurance card, his ID, and a medical power of attorney on file. And then Officer Lawson approached me from behind. He asked what I was doing with the medication. I explained it was my husband's prescription. He became aggressive, accused me of running a prescription scam, and demanded I turn around and put my hands on the counter. Did you comply?" I tried to explain that there had been a misunderstanding. I offered to show him documentation. He wasn't interested in explanations. Margaret's voice remained steady, but her hands trembled slightly. He grabbed my shoulder and spun me around. My prescription bottle fell to the floor. My reading glasses broke. He handcuffed me while I begged him to stop while I told him he was making a mistake. "What did he say to you?" "He called me Grandma. He said I should have stayed home. And he said I needed to learn my place." The courtroom was silent. "Judge Coleman, you spent 26 years on the federal bench. You presided over thousands of cases. In all that time, did you ever witness anything like what Officer Lawson did to you?" Margaret shook her head. "I sentenced corrupt officers. I saw evidence of abuse and misconduct, but I never experienced it myself until that day." She looked at the jury. "I always believed that justice was possible, that the system worked, that if you followed the rules, you would be treated fairly." Her voice cracked. "Officer Lawson showed me how naive that belief was. He showed me that for some people, for people who look like me, the rules don't apply. We're not citizens to be protected. We're targets to be exploited." Margaret wiped her eyes. "I'm 72 years old. I've dedicated my entire life to justice, and I was treated like a criminal for picking up my husband's heart medication." She looked directly at the jury. "If this can happen to a federal judge, imagine what happens to people who don't have my resources, my connections, my voice." She gestured toward the gallery where the other victims sat watching. "That's why I'm here, not for revenge, not for money. For them, for everyone who has been afraid to speak up, for everyone who believed that no one would listen." The courtroom was utterly silent. David Crawford rose for cross-examination. "Judge Coleman, you have a documented history of ruling against police officers in your courtroom. Is that correct?" "I ruled according to the law and the evidence." "In how many cases did you find officers liable for misconduct?" 23. 23 cases where you ruled against law enforcement. Would you say you have a bias against police officers?" Margaret met his eyes steadily. "I have a bias against abuse of power. I have a bias against corruption. I have a bias against officers who violate their oaths and betray public trust. If that makes me biased, then yes, Mr. Crawford, I am biased." Crawford pressed on. "On the day of the incident, did you identify yourself as a federal judge?" "I shouldn't have had to. Please answer the question. Did you identify yourself?" "Not initially, no." "So, Officer Lawson had no way of knowing he was dealing with a federal judge." "Officer Lawson had no way of knowing anything about me because he never asked. He never checked my identification. He never consulted the pharmacy staff. He made assumptions based on my appearance and acted on those assumptions without any effort to verify the facts." Crawford tried again. "But if you had simply identified yourself, if I had identified myself, what he would have treated me differently." Margaret leaned forward. "That's exactly the problem, Mr. Crawford. Justice shouldn't depend on who you are. It shouldn't matter if you're a federal judge or a retired teacher or a homeless veteran. Everyone deserves to be treated with basic dignity and respect." "But Officer Lawson didn't arrest me because I committed a crime. He arrested me because I was elderly, black, and alone, because he thought I was powerless, because he needed one more arrest to meet his quota, and I looked like an easy target." Margaret's voice rose. "That's not policing, that's predation." Crawford stepped back. "No further questions." Margaret returned to her seat. Theodore squeezed her hand as she passed. "You were magnificent," he whispered. The trial entered its third week. Captain Morrison took the stand on Monday morning. He was calm, professional, and utterly unrepentant. "Captain Morrison, did you implement a quota system for arrests in your precinct?" Morrison smiled. "We implemented performance metrics. Every organization uses metrics to evaluate employee performance. And these metrics included arrest numbers, among other factors, yes." "Were officers penalized if they didn't meet these arrest targets?" "They received counseling and additional training." "Captain Morrison, I'm showing you Exhibit 47. This is an email you sent to Officer Lawson in which you wrote, 'Your numbers are down. Get them up or face consequences.' What consequences were you referring to?" Morrison's smile flickered. "Reassignment, different shift schedules." And this email, Exhibit 48, where you wrote, "Pharmacies are target-rich environments. Elderly customers often have multiple prescriptions that can be investigated." What did you mean by target-rich environments? I meant that pharmacies often see prescription fraud. It's a legitimate area of concern. And elderly customers, why specifically elderly customers? Statistics show that elderly individuals are sometimes exploited by drug traffickers to pick up prescriptions. I was alerting my officers to a potential pattern. Foster nodded slowly. A potential pattern. So you specifically directed your officers to pay attention to elderly customers at pharmacies. Morrison hesitated. In certain contexts, yes. Contexts like Officer Lawson arresting Judge Coleman. That was an unfortunate mistake. A mistake. Foster's voice sharpened. Officer Lawson called Judge Coleman an easy target in his text messages. He followed your directives to the letter. He targeted an elderly customer at a pharmacy. How is that a mistake? It sounds like exactly what you trained him to do. Crawford objected. Argumentative. Sustained. But the damage was done. The jury had heard the connection between Morrison's policies and Lawson's actions. The trial reached its climax on Wednesday of the third week. James Foster called his final witness officer Denise Carter, the whistleblower who had risked everything to expose the corruption. Denise walked to the stand with her head held high. She had been in protective custody for weeks, isolated from everyone she knew, her career in ruins, but she showed no regret. Officer Carter, you served in Captain Morrison's precinct for 7 years. During that time, did you witness officers being pressured to meet arrest quotas? Yes, constantly. Can you describe what you saw? Denise took a breath. Officers were evaluated primarily on arrest numbers. If you didn't hit your targets, you got the worst shifts, the worst assignments. You were passed over for promotions. Your career stalled. And how did officers respond to this pressure? Some officers gamed the system. They learned to target people who wouldn't fight back. Elderly residents, minorities, homeless individuals, people with mental health issues. They called them easy stats. Did you ever report these concerns to Captain Morrison? Denise laughed bitterly. Report them. He created the system. He encouraged it. In briefings, he would talk about high-value targets and target-rich environments. He made it clear that arrest numbers were all that mattered. And what about complaints, when citizens complained about officer misconduct? Internal affairs would bury them. Morrison's brother-in-law ran internal affairs. Complaints disappeared. Officers who crossed the line were protected. Foster approached the witness stand. Officer Carter, why are you here today? You've lost your career. You've lost your colleagues. You've been living in hiding for weeks. Why come forward? Denise's eyes glistened. Because I became a cop to help people, not to be part of a system that preys on them. She looked at the jury. When I saw what happened to Judge Coleman, an elderly woman brutalized for picking up her husband's medication, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. I knew that if I didn't speak up, I was just as guilty as the officers who abused their power. She wiped her eyes. I don't know what happens next. I don't know if I'll ever work in law enforcement again, but I know I did the right thing, and that has to be enough. The courtroom was silent. Crawford declined to cross-examine. Closing arguments came on Thursday morning. James Foster stood before the jury one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard 3 weeks of testimony. You've seen documents, videos, text messages, and emails. You've heard from victims who were too afraid to speak up until now. You've heard from a whistleblower who sacrificed everything to expose the truth. He paused. The defense wants you to believe this is about one officer making one mistake, but you know better. You've seen the pattern. You've heard the evidence. This wasn't a mistake. This was a system designed to target vulnerable citizens, a system that protected abusers and silenced victims, a system that betrayed the public trust. Foster's voice rose. Judge Coleman asked you a question during her testimony. If this can happen to a federal judge, what happens to people who don't have her resources, her connections, her voice? He gestured toward the gallery. 83 people found the courage to answer that question. 83 people who were arrested without cause, humiliated without reason, traumatized without recourse. 83 stories of injustice that would never have been heard if Judge Coleman hadn't stood up and fought back. Foster faced the jury directly. Today, you have the power to send a message that abuse of power has consequences, a message that no badge, no uniform, no position of authority exempts anyone from accountability. A message that in America, justice isn't just a word. It's a promise we make to every citizen, regardless of their age, their race, or their circumstances. He stepped back. Hold them accountable. For Judge Coleman, for Dorothy Harris, for Marcus Williams, for Patricia Okonkwo, for all 83 victims, for everyone who has ever looked at a corrupt system and wondered if change was possible. Foster returned to his seat. David Crawford delivered his closing argument with practiced skill, emphasizing reasonable doubt and procedural technicalities. But his words felt hollow after everything the jury had heard. Judge Patterson gave his instructions at 2:00 p.m. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have heard the evidence and the arguments. You must now deliberate and reach a verdict. You are instructed to consider only the evidence presented in this courtroom. You must find for the plaintiffs if you believe by a preponderance of the evidence that the defendants violated the civil rights of the plaintiffs through systematic abuse, false arrest, and conspiracy. He looked at the jury. This is a significant responsibility. Take the time you need, consider carefully, and when you reach a verdict, notify the bailiff. The jury filed out. Margaret sat in the courtroom as it emptied around her. Theodore sat beside her holding her hand. "How long do you think they'll take?" he asked. "I don't know. Hours, days. There's no way to predict." "Are you worried?" Margaret thought about the question. "I'm at peace. Whatever happens, we did everything we could. We told the truth. We fought for justice. And if they don't convict, then we appeal. We keep fighting. We never stop." Margaret squeezed his hand. "That's what you taught me, Theo. That justice isn't something that happens to us. It's something we create." Theodore smiled. "I taught you well. You taught me everything." They sat together in the empty courtroom, waiting for a verdict that would change their lives forever. The jury deliberated for 18 hours. At 4:47 p.m. on Friday, the bailiff emerged. "The jury has reached a verdict." The courtroom filled rapidly. Margaret took her seat, Theodore behind her. Morrison sat at the defense table, his face pale but composed. The jury filed in. Margaret tried to read their faces, but they were carefully neutral. Judge Patterson addressed the foreperson. "Has the jury reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor. Please read the verdict." The foreperson unfolded the paper. Margaret's heart pounded. In the matter of Coleman et al. Versus the City of Montgomery, the Montgomery Police Department. Captain Frank Morrison, Officer Derek Lawson, and others, we the jury find as follows. The courtroom held its breath. On the count of systematic violation of civil rights, we find the defendants guilty. A gasp swept through the courtroom. On the count of false arrest and imprisonment, we find the defendants guilty. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. On the count of conspiracy to deprive citizens of their constitutional rights, we find the defendants guilty. The courtroom erupted. People cheered, cried, embraced each other. Margaret turned to see Theodore weeping openly, his face radiant with joy. On the matter of damages, we award the plaintiffs compensatory damages of $47 million to be distributed among the 83 victims according to the severity of their injuries. $47 million. Margaret could barely process the number. Furthermore, we award punitive damages of $100 million against the City of Montgomery and the Montgomery Police Department to fund reforms and oversight measures as determined by the court. $147 million. The largest civil rights verdict in Alabama history. Judge Patterson banged his gavel trying to restore order. The defendants will be remanded into custody pending sentencing. This court is adjourned. Margaret stood on shaky legs. Behind her, Theodore was struggling to his feet. She turned and embraced him, holding him tight as the chaos swirled around them. "We did it," she whispered. "We did it, Theo. You did it, Maggie. You changed everything." The other victims surrounded them: Dorothy Harris, Marcus Williams, Patricia Okonkwo, Officer Denise Carter. They embraced, tears flowing freely. "Thank you," Dorothy said, clutching Margaret's hands. "Thank you for giving us our voices back." "You always had your voices," Margaret replied. "You just needed someone to listen." Across the courtroom, Morrison was being led away in handcuffs. He passed Margaret on his way out, and their eyes met one final time. "This isn't over," he hissed. Margaret shook her head. "Yes, it is. For you." She watched him disappear through the doors, feeling nothing but relief. The crowd swept Margaret and Theodore outside, where hundreds of supporters had gathered. They cheered when Margaret appeared, chanting her name, holding signs celebrating justice. Rachel Torres pushed through the crowd with a microphone. "Judge Coleman, how do you feel?" Margaret looked at the crowd, at Theodore, at the courthouse behind her, where justice had finally been served. "I feel grateful," she said. "Grateful for everyone who supported us. Grateful for the victims who found the courage to come forward. Grateful for a jury that listened to the evidence and made the right decision." She paused. "But most of all, I feel hopeful. Hopeful that this verdict sends a message, that abuse of power will not be tolerated, that every citizen, regardless of their age or race or circumstances, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect." Margaret took Theodore's hand. "My husband told me something at the beginning of this fight. He told me that justice isn't something that happens to us. It's something we create. Today, together, we created justice, and I hope, I pray that this is just the beginning." The crowd roared. 6 months later, Margaret stood at a podium in the Montgomery City Hall. The room was filled with dignitaries, journalists, and citizens who had come to witness a historic moment. Behind her hung a banner that read, "Margaret Coleman, Community Oversight Board, Protecting Citizens, Ensuring Accountability." Theodore sat in the front row, looking healthier than he had in years. His heart surgery had been a success, and months of careful recovery had restored much of his strength. He smiled at Margaret as she approached the microphone. "Good afternoon," Margaret began. 6 months ago, I stood in a federal courtroom and asked a jury to hold a corrupt police department accountable. They did. Today, I stand here to announce the next chapter in our fight for justice. She gestured to the banner behind her. The Margaret Coleman Community Oversight Board will be an independent body charged with reviewing police conduct, investigating complaints, and ensuring that the abuses of the past can never happen again. It will be staffed by citizens, not politicians. It will have subpoena power and full access to department records, and it will report directly to the public. Margaret looked out at the crowd. This board exists because of the courage of 83 victims who came forward, because of a whistleblower who sacrificed her career to expose the truth, because of journalists who refused to let the story die, because of citizens who demanded accountability. She smiled. And because of a stubborn old man who refused to let me give up. The crowd laughed. Theodore blew her a kiss. "I'm 72 years old," Margaret continued. "I've spent my whole life fighting for justice. I thought I was done. I thought I could retire and let someone else carry the burden." She shook her head. "I was wrong. Justice isn't something you retire from. It's something you live, every day, every moment, every time you see injustice and choose to speak up instead of stay silent." Margaret's voice grew stronger. "The fight isn't over. It will never be over. There will always be people who abuse power. There will always be systems that protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. There will always be a need for ordinary citizens to stand up and demand better." She looked directly into the cameras. "But today we celebrate a victory, not just for the victims, not just for Montgomery, for everyone who has ever looked at a corrupt system and wondered if change was possible." Margaret raised her hand. "Change is possible. Justice is possible. A better world is possible. We just have to be willing to fight for it." The crowd erupted in applause. After the ceremony, Margaret and Theodore walked slowly through the streets of Montgomery. The sun was setting, casting golden light across the city they had called home for decades. "How do you feel?" Theodore asked. Margaret considered the question. 6 months ago, she had been an anonymous retiree worried about her husband's health and the quiet routines of old age. Now she was a national symbol, her name synonymous with courage and justice. "I feel tired," she admitted, "and grateful and hopeful. That sounds about right." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, two people who had weathered storms and survived, who had loved each other through everything life had thrown at them. "Theo. Thank you." Theodore stopped and looked at her. "For what?" "For believing in me, for standing beside me, for refusing to let me give up." Margaret's eyes glistened. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Theodore cupped her face in his hands, the way he had done for 49 years. "You could have done all of it without me. You're Margaret Coleman. You don't need anyone." "That's not true." "It is true. But I'm glad you chose to let me come along for the ride." Theodore smiled. "These 49 years have been the greatest adventure of my life." "Only 49. We're just getting started." Margaret laughed and kissed him softly, tenderly, right there on the sidewalk as the sun set over Montgomery. They walked home hand in hand, two people who had fought for justice and won. But the story doesn't end there. In the months that followed, the Margaret Coleman Community Oversight Board became a model for cities across America. Dozens of police departments implemented similar reforms. The Department of Justice cited the Montgomery case as a template for addressing systematic misconduct. Dorothy Harris became an advocate for elderly rights, speaking at conferences and community events about the importance of standing up to abuse. Marcus Williams founded a support group for veterans who had experienced police misconduct. Patricia Okonkwo's dashcam footage became required viewing in police academies nationwide. Officer Denise Carter was reinstated to the force and promoted to head of internal affairs, the first woman and first whistleblower to hold the position. Derek Lawson served 18 months in federal prison. Upon his release, he disappeared from public life, his name forever linked to the case that changed everything. Frank Morrison received 5 years for conspiracy and obstruction. His sister Linda, who had provided the evidence that broke the case open, reconciled with her brother's victims and became a fierce advocate for police reform. And Margaret Coleman. She never stopped fighting. At 73, she published a memoir that became a bestseller. At 74, she testified before Congress about police reform. At 75, she received the Presidential Medal of Freedom for her lifetime of service to justice. But her greatest joy came on the morning of her 50th wedding anniversary, when she woke up beside Theodore in the same bed they had shared for half a century. "Good morning, Mrs. Coleman." "Good morning, Mr. Coleman." 50 years, can you believe it? Margaret smiled. "Some days it feels like 50 minutes. Theodore laughed. "Some days it feels like 50 centuries. She swatted his arm playfully. "Watch it, old man. Make me old woman." They lay there in comfortable silence, listening to the birds outside their window, feeling the warmth of the morning sun. "Maggie, yes, I'm proud of you for everything you've done, everything you've accomplished, everything you've become." Margaret turned to face her husband. His face was lined with age, his hair completely white now, but his eyes, those warm brown eyes she had fallen in love with, were the same as they had always been. "I'm proud of us," she said, "of what we've built together, of who we've become together." Theodore smiled and pulled her close. "We make a good team. The best." And they lay there together as the morning light filled the room. Two people who had fought for justice, and one who had loved each other through everything, who had proven that ordinary people can change the world when they refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. Sometimes justice wears reading glasses and carries heart medication. Sometimes it speaks 5 words that change everything. Sometimes it requires an elderly woman to teach powerful people about real strength. Margaret Coleman proved that dignity cannot be handcuffed, truth cannot be silenced, and injustice delayed but never denied always finds its way home. Your voice matters. Your story matters. When you see injustice, speak up. because you never know whose life you might change, even your own.